Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure to have a conversation with Julian Hunt, who I haven't had a conversation with for about 58 years, since we were both boys together at the Dragon. So, Julian, I always start by asking when and where you were born.
So I was born in 5th of September 1941 in Uttakamand in India, which is in South India in the Nilgiri Hills. It's a hill station. It now is called Udagamandalaam in Tamil Nadu. So I always slightly feel like a character out of Oscar Wilde. If the place you were born in has changed its name, are you really real? But my father was in Indian civil service. He was a district officer in various areas of South India, but he actually, I was born there in the hill station as the British often went up there in the summer and when their babies were born. It was nice weather there. At other times, we lived in other parts of South India until 1947, when I returned, my father returned with the Indian independence. And we had quite a lot of sort of dramas there, and one of the ones I always remember was being with my brother and seeing two villagers bringing in a dead tiger on and carried on a big pole between them.
How old were you then? Really?
4. But the main thing about it, which even connects to the Dragon School, is that I developed a tremendous fear of people having their faces painted, because when we were in India, we very often saw these naked men, sort of holy men, walking down this. I remember vividly these people walking on the paths in the hill station, covered in garish colours and with their faces painted. And I was obviously very frightened by this, because I think I got the sense of fear from my mother. Well, that's what she explained to me. And so I was a very fearful boy and very frightened. By big noises or people being painted. So even at the Dragon School, later on, when the boys put makeup on for the play, I had to walk around the playground with my hand over my face, because I was so frightened. And I've always been slightly, I'm always still worried or frightened by anybody, any sort of sudden appearance. We went back to India recently with my wife, and we went on a bus, and suddenly the bus conductor had his face all painted in garish colours. I suddenly remembered as a small boy being terrified of this vision. It's quite strange, really.
Mm.
And so I was quite a tearful, frightened boy. And the thing that really used to upset me was coming back from India. We came back from India in the middle of the war, 1943, 44, in a convoy with U-boats.
You came back twice, did you? Because you said you came back in 47 as well.
Well, that's when we returned finally.
I see,
so
yeah.
there was one period in between when we came
Yeah.
back on leave.
Yeah.
Still there were U-boats and convoys and on deck and wearing lifebelts and the awful thing is everybody had to keep singing this song. I'm H-A-P-P-Y, I'm H-A-P-P-Y, I know I am, I think I am, I'm H-A-P-P-Y.
Was this a Christian song?
I don't know. It was just a song. Everybody, I've met now many people of my generation who all know this song.
I know it, but it was through Christian boys' camps.
Oh, really?
Because Jesus had come into your life, and that was why you were H-A-P-P-Y.
I used to sing it with tears rolling down my cheeks most of the time, in these sort of strange kind of canteens and on one of the ships. But so it was a sort of colourful life, and there were many times when I was frightened people didn't come. But on the other hand, on Christmas Day we always had the snake charmer came, and we had the cobra doing his thing on the drawing room floor, and we had buffaloes in the garden. My father used to chase them away. It was all lots of high drama in that way, and my mother used to find it very, very. She found the heat very difficult, and she was terribly, terribly angry. she used to spend hot afternoons trying to teach me to read. And the word that I really got stuck on was the. And so it was one very hot afternoon which I just kept getting stuck when we got to the. And obviously it was a sort of blockage, and I just had to be put away in some other room, shouting and screaming while she. So it was sort of, it was quite. It wasn't. It was a very sort of.
Did you have an ayah?
Oh, we had an ayah. That's right. Yes, and one of the things my brother and I did very naughtily was to take the ayah's soap and throw it down in the bathroom, and then turn the bathroom into a skating rink. I don't know why we knew about a skating rink in India. We created this marvellous slidey, sloppy surface where we skidded around. So it was. I couldn't say that we got to know many at all young Indian boys of our own age. It was all a very kind of, the only Indians we met were ayahs and bearers and chauffeurs, and the person who brought the milk to the back door was bringing a cow, and we milked and it was milked and so on. So it was very much we were in the colonial life really. And we had many good friends, But perhaps the most frightening kind of event of all, which was rather amusing because I now met the woman whose father organised this, was Christmas Day of I think 1945, 46 in Madras, where we then lived, which is now called Chennai. So we all went to this Christmas party on the beach, and Father Christmas arrived, but Father Christmas arrived in a landing craft through the waves. So it's still absolutely vivid in my mind, this figure in this red Father Christmas costume standing in a landing craft, coming through the surf. I just thought this was the most frightening thing, and I ran. I ran, but for half a mile away. This was the most awful apparition I could possibly imagine. Everybody else thought this was fantastic. So it was curious that, and I don't know what the long-term consequences, but it was certainly.
Can we just go back a little bit? Sometimes people are. I don't know whether you were looked after as I was by your grandparents, but grandparents sometimes have quite a lot of influence. Did you know your grandparents?
Well, this was later, because when we came back to England in 1947, we lived in Oxford, and I lived close by to my mother's parents, and he was called Maxwell Garnett. And they were very influential. So Maxwell Garnett was a scientist. So this was the first time I met a sort of scientist, another important one. And he was a fellow. He was a fellow of Trinity, and he'd written important papers on mathematics. But then he'd become a great internationalist. He was secretary of the League of Nations Union in Britain, and he was very sort of strong, sort of primitive Christian as well. And he used to take us for walks in the park, and then he used to come out to our house and boom out the Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, Lars Porcium Occlusium, 9 gods he swore it, that kind of stuff, shouting through their eyes. So it was kind of from Indian temples to sort of bellowing out.
You were terrified of him as well.
Fairly, yes. And he did these terrible sort of grandfatherly tricks of putting 2 pennies in his 2 eyes, and then dropping them. It was so, and then at Christmas, it was even worse. Having left the temples of India, then we had sort of 4 Father Christmases arrive in Oxford. I just ran and was terrified. It was.
Where were you living in Oxford?
So we were living in Park Town, which is right near the Dragon School,
yeah.
and my grandparents. Interesting enough, but they used their basement because they had a down garage, a big house, as the sort of communal canteen. So we all used to eat in this sort of communal canteen, and we put in all our ration books. It was a sort of communal living of the 40s was carried on. So when we returned then, but I would also spend a lot of time seeing my other grandparents. So my grandfather's, my father's father lived in Woodstock Road, and
what was he?
And he'd been the chief inspector of schools in Oxford. But later on in my life, when I was at the Dragon School, I was a boarder there most of the time, because my father then, having returned to Britain really for only about a year, he then joined the British next to my grandparents. So we spent a lot of time with my grandparents. So in fact, I would say I was brought up more by my grandparents perhaps than my parents. So on one hand, I had this extraordinary stuff about Macaulay and mathematics and sailing with my mother's father, and on my other side, we had this extraordinary experience of my grandfather, Hunt, who'd been a prisoner in the First World War, but was a great lover of German and many things German. Both my grandparents were great love of German, and it's because all the people of that generation were. Before the First World War, they all went to Germany, and Germany was their sort of great mecca of civilization and lifestyle. And in fact, my great-grandfather had been to Munich in the late part of the last century to do medicine, and that's where my grandfather on that side grew up. So because he'd been a prisoner of war in the First World War, one of the things he did was to invite German prisoners of war who were at Oxford to come for Sunday tea. So we used to have these German prisoners of war, who still remained in these camps after the war was over. And he used to play kind of battleships and submarines with them, which is a tactless kind of thing to do. So it was therefore a very broadening experience, and we taught all sorts of stories and histories about life. And he used to go down to the Oxford prison 2 or 3 times a week as a prison visitor, and then come back and tell us boys about all these people. So I think it was a very broadening experience in a way. It wasn't all politics, but we were being told about a very broad world of experience and how the world had changed. And my grandfather, my other grandfather, Maxwell Garney, when he wasn't telling us about Macaulay, battle, arrangements in the Battle of Waterloo, would be telling us in intricate detail about all the different 27 countries created by the Treaty of Versailles. It maps on the wall in Oxford. So it was it was sort of very broad experience, and I think very few children have that at an early stage. Some of them can get it later, but I think if you do have this international introductions and how the world is what it is through personal experiences and what people have done, I think gives you a terrific basis for then understanding the world as you grow up. If you learn all about it later on, as some people do, it's never quite the same thing as it were. I think having this depth early on, I'm grateful for that.
Can
Really.
you? Your mother went with your father on these Commonwealth missions.
She went there for some of the time, and she stayed back. Stayed back.
Did you? I've had an absolute parallel to you, even down to coming back in '47, and I've always felt that having parents who left you for say 2 years or so, as with Kipling, had a deep effect on me in one way or another. Do you think that was the case with you? Did you feel left or upset about suddenly them disappearing for a long period?
Well, it's funny to say that, but it didn't a lot. I suppose because you were brought up in India, so much of the time you were actually being looked after by other people. So then back in England, I looked after other people, was more or the same in a way. And I probably was a very difficult and not a very lovable child. I think I was very, very difficult. My father always found me very difficult. Whereas my brother, my younger brother, was Simon. He was very, very jolly and very smiley, and my mother could sometimes pour out feelings to him, and he actually equally was I think very cut up by not seeing my parents more than myself. But on the other hand, I corresponded. I was zealous. I think, as you said, you were yourself a zealous correspondent. Every week, in a way, my troubles I poured out on Sunday letters of one sort or another, and I was always very pleased to see them. And you know, my father was a marvelous father. Played a lot with us, you know, the weekends, and played with our soldiers and all these sort of things, and we played sports with them. But I suppose one had just accepted this sort of this life, you know, of someone who's been looked after, and then grandparents were terribly important. So I spent more Sundays with my grandparents than with my parents when I was on the border. So when we went to the Dragon School, first of all, we were living in Oxford. So when I was there, I first of all went to the state primary school, Cutslow, which was a very fashionable primary school. It has been built in North Oxford. And I'm sure you know, there was the famous social history book of the Cutslow Wall, this famous wall. You know, there's a book.
Oh yes, I did.
There was a wall built in North Oxford to separate the sort of owner-occupied houses from the council estate. So the council estate people wouldn't walk or drive through the owner-occupied areas to get onto the Banbury Road. They had to go out onto the bypass and come round, as did the bus, in order to get to this sort of primary school on the council estate. Apparently there was one great moment in the war when some soldier returning on leave came with his tank and broke the wall down, which was then it's a real sort of class, you know, a class wall, as it were. But anyway, so we went to school. I was there from I suppose 47 to 49 to this primary school in a big class of 40, and we had all sorts of boys and girls there from the estate, mostly from the estates in North Oxford. There were a few people, but the most interesting thing which I always tell people about was that I was there when in 1947 in the playground, boys would run around the playground with their arms stretched out, and they were that sort of aeroplane. By 1949, the aeroplane wings had all moved to the sort of to the sloping wings, the new sort of jets, you know, sloping wings. It was quite funny, you know.
That's interesting that you noticed it too.
Yes. Well, I noticed at the time, but equally I've been recalling, you know, in my mind, trying to recall what kinds of technology changed people and how it changed, you know. And rather like now, a few years ago, you saw little children on the tube, you know, pretending to play with a mobile phone, using their hand as a mobile phone. You know? So children sort of quickly pick up on technology and enters their games, and it was quite.
Even at that stage, I mean, talking of games and so on, this is up to the age of 8 or so before you went to the Dragon. Do you remember any hobbies or activities you were particularly keen on?
Well, I was already, I mean, you know, building bricks and trains and so on. And to have my mathematical grandfather, who was a fellow of Trinity, building these unbelievable bricks, spans of old-fashioned Victorian bricks, chunks of rectangular wood, you know. And then by very clever balancing, he could span about 5 feet, you know, by putting weights on one side. So it was just sort of magic, you know. So and so I think my interest in sort of mathematics and science was very much connected to all these experiences.
And engineering, obviously.
Engineering, yes. And so in the holidays, my mother's parents had this place in the Isle of Wight with canoes and sailing boats, and we went there for holidays. And so, you know, going sailing and rowing and talking about the stars at night, looking through telescopes and faraway places, you know. So you know, we were sort of experiencing things, but all the time it was through this obviously prism of a grandfather who was a scientist, you know, who explained it in those terms, and that I think was very influential. But the so essentially, so I was there at the primary school till 49, and then I went to the Dragon School.
Straight away as a boarder.
No. First of all, I was a day boy there, but being looked after by this
Yes.
this lady, Miss Ayres, in this house.
So you didn't go to a junior house, I mean a first house like...
No, I did. No, I did. Well, so I went. So in 50.
50.
In 50, December. So January 51, I went to Wildings, which was a small house in Dragons, and that was just terrible. It was just terrible. And we were in this dormitory of about 5, you see, and then we all, and everybody, the lights went out, and then of course the boys started talking from time to time, and then suddenly the housemaster would storm in and, "Who's talking?" You know, and some people would own up and some people wouldn't own up, and they would jump out of their bed, and then he would beat them, you know, really beat them with these sort of slippers and so on. And one of the boys was beaten so severely that his marks were on his bottom, you know, even when he came back the next term after 5 weeks. I mean, that's pretty serious. So I said to him, "Look, this is disgraceful." So here was I, well, I was 9, 10. I said, "Look, this is disgraceful. You should go to the police station and complain." So, but he didn't, of course, and his father, his master himself. But it was sort of extraordinary, really, you know. So this man Wilding was in fact quite a brilliant teacher, and he wrote many books on Latin.
L.A. Wilding, yes.
Quite well known, and he'd been a fellow of New College, Oxford, and he was a very distinguished, distinguished kind of academic classicist. And he was the form master for the top class of Dragons, and he pushed all the boys through to get scholarships at Eton and Winchester in Latin and so on. You know, so he was a formidable person, but he smoked like a chimney. He was very angry, and in the morning he would even make jokes at breakfast. We all ate together at this family table, and it was like old Dother Boys' Hall. I mean, on Sundays he'd bring a huge, great sort of pork joint, and we'd sit there, the boys, and he'd carve it up and keep giving it all to all the guests, and we all just wondered how much of this was actually going to be left for us. You know? And he would say, "Oh boys, I thought you'd be one of the crackling." We said yes. No, well, the crackling. I mean, it was just ridiculous, you know. It was so. Anyway, so I had my sort of revenge, which was a sort of as an inadvertent revenge, which was that my uncle came and visited us once and left me a pineapple, which a pineapple in England in 1951 was sort of like gold. It was just extraordinary, you know. And but I didn't finish it by the end of term, you see. I shared it out with my friends very parsimoniously, a bit at a time, you know. Then we came back in May, and one day we were all sleeping under their beds, and suddenly the housemaster started shouting, "Who's taken the pineapple?" You see, and it turned out he had bought himself a pineapple. But I, that afternoon, had come in and seen this pineapple. I thought, "Oh, I thought that's my old pineapple," and I shared it up, and we'd all eaten it. So he came for his supper, and he was expecting to see this pineapple, and it wasn't there. So he roared upstairs, and he turned on the lights, and he shouted through all the dormitories, "Who's?" So I said, "Well, look, I thought it was my pineapple." "Oh, how stupid you are, Hunt! How could he be so stupid? Don't you realise a pineapple will decay after 4 hours?" So even he didn't beat me for that. I felt I was so stupid and naive that so.
Did you have any, what they call in the army, I think, hazing? In other words, I mean, that's the one thing I remember about plumbers, was the boys who were already there, putting you through various tricks to terrify you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So no, there was a good deal of that, and so there was a sort of a war between 2 or 3. One of them was this friend of mine who was severely beaten by the housemaster, and he and I would sort of declare a sort of a war on the others, and I would, you know, the war would continue sort of 24 hours a day down at the Dragons. If I saw somebody from the other side who was nasty to us, we'd go around and we'd jump on them. And I was quite big, and so I kept my end up. I mean, it was, you know, so nobody beat me up, but I mean, it was extraordinary. So it was a very, but perhaps the most, even more so extraordinary those things was was writing on Sunday, so we wrote letters home, you see. And we'd be sitting there on the desk writing letters home. And the housemaster would walk around and see what we were writing, you see. And so I wrote, the boys are terrible, they're all awful, and so on. And the housemaster came around and picked up my letter home and scrumpled it up in front of my eyes. He said, you better come and talk to me, you see. So he then said, well, why do you think this is so, you're having such bad relations with all the boys, and you think they're so terrible? He said, do you think, Hunt, you're just a prig? He said. So well, I said, well, I probably am a bit of a prig, and he said, well, you could get on better with them if you didn't do this and didn't do that. But so actually it was quite a rather severe form of reflective discussion, or therapy, you say nowadays. Sort of therapy, dragon style.
What was the food like? That's something else I remember as being appalling in the first year.
Well, it wasn't too bad in his house, because he liked good food himself, but what was diabolical was then going to the schoolhouse, going to the big, we went to be a board at the schoolhouse.
Was that your second year you went there? Or
I think I was after about a year and a half. And, 52.
What was, tell me about this move to the schoolhouse.
Well, in a way, in some ways, it was a bigger sphere, bigger dormitories of 18, 19 people, so you certainly weren't under this extraordinary.
All named after dead or extinct species, weren't they?
That's right. Yes, that's right. Ichthyosaurus and Brontosaurus. Yes, you started off with some smaller ones, and then you went to bigger ones. That's right. Yeah. So. But what I had to tell you was just to come back to fill up the story of being dragons. Was one of my other things, which is a really bad thing to do, is to sleepwalk if you're in a boarding house. And on one night in this house, just
in Wildings.
Yes. I suddenly woke up, and we'd been doing French at school that day, and I still is in my mind, because if you sleepwalk, you have the vision in your mind. And I walked round this house, and I went round all these beds, and I was touching people's toes through the dormitory. And I finally got into a room, a locker room at the top of the house, and I was trying to climb underneath the cupboard. And by that time, the entire house was awake, because I'd been beating and banging. I mean, all the dormitories were awake. The matron, the housemaster, the house in their pajamas. And so on. They said, "What the hell are you doing, Hunt?" So I said, "I'm looking for je suis." That's what I was, I suppose. Because obviously learning je suis was quite a stress for me. So I think they did find it quite difficult. So these are the outward and manifest symptoms of obviously something,
churning around.
Yeah. But the boarding house, it was I was getting bigger, I suppose, and sort of nearly maturing, and I became a much more confident and happier person.
Do you remember those
both in school and in sport, and I was by the time I got 11, 12, 13, I began to feel sort of more successful. I found friends. I sort of enjoyed sort of funny competitive world, marbles, and all those things I wanted. So it was a really a really difficult passage, that one, for going through and the feeling being at war with really my friends and my colleagues in this house.
But that was at the beginning. It got better in your second, third year.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, but particularly when I went to the schoolhouse.
I mean, just tell me one or two, for me, things like skating on the ice rink in front of the schoolhouse, or special memories of.
Well, no, that was a very special time when all the boys were given these sort of skates. We put on these funny little cricket boots that we had, and we skated there, and the masters sprayed the lawn. And we did that. But equally, I mean that was. But what I recall in a way as being kind of more extraordinary was going and skating on Port Meadow when that flooded, and you sort of skated for mile after mile over these frozen, flooded fields or towards Wildercott. It was quite magical for me, and but it was very cold, and I do remember getting feeling just unbelievably sort of cold when coming back and being on bitter about that. But And of course in the summer, you know, rushing down sort of naked, literally naked, you know, over the fields to the river and jumping and swimming, and then having these swimming tests,
Clothes tests.
clothes tests, and I don't know whether you remember being taught to swim on this sort of extraordinary kind of belt and a rope, you know, and one of the people who was in charge, each of there were these funny landing stages along the river there, and the masters held you there and walked you up and down. And if you were with a particularly cruel and angry master, Tubby Haig, who'd been in the First World War, he used to stamp on people's fingers if they put their fingers out of the. Oh, it's terrible. So, I mean, one of the curious things I've noticed is through my life, you see, and I must even tell from I recall a lot of bad stories all the time about people being cruel, and I would always find the boys who had something cruel done to them, and I would try to talk to them and understand it. I was sort of on, I don't know, look out for it, but I was very conscious of that. And the moment it happened, then I was sort of very angry for them, and so there were, you know, things like that, and it was, I mean, in the school, I mean, in the classrooms, I mean, you know, masters would regularly throw these quite heavy duty board erasers, you know, or rubbers that we say, you know, at your head.
And there used to be public beatings, I remember, in the old hall, just occasionally when someone had done something appalling, in front of the whole school.
That's right. That's very rare. That's right. Yes.
Very rare, but
yes, that's right. And boxing, you see, you know, I mean, I've mentioned the First World War, but I have not mentioned until now the Boer War, because it just in order to complete the last century, because we were taught. So I was taught by several masters who taught my father the dragons my father was at the dragon school in the late 20s. And so, for example, Jakes, who taught us, brilliant teacher. I mean, I always remember how Jakes taught us the indirect speech. So the boy had to go. The boy, you know, had to go out of the room, and then he came into the room. He said, and the master said to him, you know, what did Caesar do? He said, the boy said, Caesar pitched camp. And then they asked the class, what did he say? He said that Caesar had pitched camp. So therefore one always remembered, you know, indirect speech by this boy going out of the class and into the class. Dragons did a lot of this business of very physical teaching, you know? And we learned mathematics by slamming our desks down, you know, on various occasions. But anyway, to return to, so some of these teachers, you know, have been teaching there since 1960, since after the First World War. But this man, who's called the Infernal Colonel Pernell, he did PE, physical education, and he'd been a sergeant in the army in the Boer War, and he taught boxing. One of the, so I did this very briefly, and so we distributed these boxing gloves, and we started doing all this sort of thing, and I reduced one boy I was boxing to tears. So Colonel said, "Come on, he's crying. In you go, left, right, left, right." I said, "I'm not doing this." You know? It's terrible. And dear. Anyway, so
talking of other kind of similar things to boxing in another way, were you a devotee of the dancing? Do you remember we used to dance with other little boys?
Other little boys, that's right. And this man called Retty, Mr. Retty, he used to run the band from the Linton Lodge Hotel. Yeah, that's right. That was rather extraordinary. My brother broke his finger in the dance because one of the key moments of the dragon dance, you know, so-called dance, was that he did the gallop, and the gallop, which is long since I think departed from most dance routines, was the most favourite of the dragons. And then there was the business of what's called the pile-up. So somebody more or less deliberately crashed, and then the entire sort of people all piled on top of him. My brother was in the bottom, and he broke his finger. So you know, it was dangerous stuff. You know, and then sometimes we had these girls came off from Witchwood School.
Yes.
But we did learn. I mean, I went on learned the waltz and the kind of military two-step and all these sort of things. Instead, it was really very useful when I went to Poland once on a conference, and and I found these Polish girls who actually knew the polka, and that was I think the first and last time I've ever really, outside the Dragon School, really done the polka, which was sort of something they still do in Poland.
Who were the other teachers? You mentioned Jacko. Were there any other teachers who particularly...
Oh, well, the other man who I really, really liked was a man called Hicks. Because he had a house next to yours, Plumbers, and F.E. Hicks. And he had a boat which he moored on the Charwell, at the end of the playing fields. And so he believed in using mathematics to teach you navigation. So we had to really think trigonometry was useful when he would explain how, when he was sailing his boat, he wanted to know where he was by taking two angles from two spots on the land, two church towers or a cliff, and then from the map he could work out where he was. And so he was a brilliant teacher, and he also, of course, he'd been a prisoner in the Second World War. He'd been with the Oxford Bucks, and they were all captured in Dunkirk, and he spent 5 years. And so I mentioned this, the wars, because I just, not for other people, but one was brought up with this tremendous sort of memories, of group memories of all these elderly, so many of the people you were dealing with had these extraordinary experiences, and they weren't bitter about it, but it how was it? It's difficult to say, but you felt in a way I suppose one part you felt we were fortunate. We were where we were because of these people's contributions and experiences, and I guess I've felt that in my own life.
One of the things that the Dragon specialised, or thought it was special about, was the way we addressed the masters. If you remember, we called them by their nicknames,
right.
Gov and Jacko and things like this, and it was meant to partly to make them into kind of older brothers rather than enemies, certainly out of class. Did that strike you, or has it struck you as an odd thing?
Well, no, I thought that was a lovely thing, and some of them were, one was very friendly with them, and you could sort of ask them all sorts of things. But it was a sort of, I didn't fall for it quite as much as ever, because the same man who would call you putty nose, the next day he'd be throwing a piece of board rubber at you, and if you picked it up, throw it back at him, then it would obviously not be a good idea. So I was slightly queried, the kind of the relationship, because it is very difficult to maintain discipline and do that. And on the whole, the Dragon was a disciplined place, and but I think because I am suspicious or concerned, I felt that there was a peculiarity in that, and I felt it was an awkwardness, as it were. We were pretending things that were difficult. And then the same master whom you were saying Gov to, then they would come in, they would be on dormitory duty, and they would come in and they'd beat the boys and so on. So it was but anyway, it sort of worked for that period, and all I can say is the masters were extremely kind to people, and one of the most remarkable things was that when I left Dragons, my last term, sort of term and a half of Dragons, I was beginning to be very ill, and although I was head of house, I had the most acute pains in my arm, and this was in fact an incipient tumour developing on my spine, which materialised later when I was at Westminster. But when I left Dragons, and I was in hospital for 6 weeks in London, in a very awful situation, the Dragon Masters came to see me and so on. It was just extraordinary, really. And besides, it was very, very special. That so it was. But the kind of thing. The other thing about Dragons was that it was a school that made people very ambitious. It was interesting. We had a famous half holiday or whole holiday when Gateskill became Chancellor in 1952 or thereabouts. Oh, it must have been 51. That's right, yeah, because of the Labour government. and he was an old dragon, so this was a great moment. And I think that's sort of, it's interesting. Here was a person from our school who reached this high point, and we talked about it. So this, that was a sort of. And the other thing I was going to say about scholarships. I mean, if you were in the scholarship form in Upper One, Wilding would say, "My God, Hunt, this bit of prose, you wouldn't get as far as Didcot." He said. So in other words, it was funnily enough. This is at Westminster. It's in both the schools I was at. You were the kind of progress you were making towards these two great goals. Dragons was to become the top scholar at Winchester or Eton, and I was a long way from that. And when I was at Westminster, was to getting to Cambridge or Oxford, and therefore your progress was entirely judged as to how many, in terms of where you progressed on the railway line from your school towards this sort of great academic goal. It was terribly sort of British of that time, and so a really good piece of work. My goodness me, you might have got to Reading West by now.
You were, I mean, one of the highlights for many people, including myself, were dramatics, either of Shakespeare plays, which I've never in, or Gilbert and Sullivan. Were you in any of those?
No, I wasn't. No. I remember you were in one, but no, I was not even a spear carrier. I think in part because of, as I mentioned to you, my kind of fear of this whole business of dressing up. Yes. I was so deeply worried by that. Although I enjoy going to the plays, but I was very bad at am very bad at singing, so I was not allowed to sing. I was quickly sort of removed from the singing group. So that was, but the point about it was that one became very familiar with so much Shakespeare. I mean, that was so extraordinary about Dragons, and one sort of remembers it, and which very few people had. I mean, okay, people from other schools may have had done their O-levels and A-levels, but I mean, we were doing this and sort of sitting on the grass in the summer.
So you acted in Shakespeare, the Shakespeare plays?
No, I didn't. No, I'm just saying that as part of the play in the summer, there would be classes in the lessons. You'd be doing the play, and it all seemed very real because the play was going to come, and therefore I think everybody learned a lot about the plays. Well, that's how I remember it.
But you were in quite a lot of, or we were together on various cricket and other teams.
Yes. Not cricket, but I was in the rugger and hockey and soccer, and I enjoyed that a lot. And I played in some sort of not very good cricket matches, and that was again a marvellous business of being very close to the team, to the masters. We'd go on these funny sort of second-hand cars driving off to these other schools, and it was also a great treat to come back and have a drink in a pub or have a high tea and sort of fried eggs in Anstons and Oxford after the games. It was all a great adventure, and they made it great fun. But it was quite an ordeal, those sort of wet, cold afternoons, running about, getting very muddy, and a great plunge afterwards. It was that was very much part of my life, really. And I think you've got I think what I learned from that, perhaps more than anything else, was the extraordinary sense of achievement of doing things in a group, really, and the pleasure of doing things in a group, which to me has always been almost greater than doing things individually. So group success is a very pleasurable experience, a different sort of experience. But in a way, Dragons was quite good because for some of the people, we had great stars, and you were one of them, on the stage and so on, which is individual kind of greatness, as it were. But the kind of sporting achievement was one in which you sort of saw the pleasure of doing things in a group. And I even had an argument with my wife the other day. I was talking about some scientific work, and I said, we did this and we did that. She said, you don't mean we, you mean you did it. Well, I said, sort of, yeah, but it's fun doing it together. I mean, this is more of arts people, it's all, you write your book yourself mostly, but it's something that is about science. It's so much of it is the pleasure of doing it as a group.
Talking of science, I mean, I mentioned earlier Gert Sommerhoff. Did you get to know him? Did he teach you?
Funnily enough, I sort of.
So he later came to Trinity, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. That's right. No, I talked to him there. I wasn't a great lover of. I mean, I went to the classes and I wasn't particularly good at it because really what I found so fascinating was all this business of mathematics and sort of mechanics and navigation and trigonometry and that's what and that connected to me to what I did at home with my electric trains and my building and Meccano and so on. Gert was not so much into that side of science. It was looking at a microscope at these awful things we were swimming through on the Charwell and swallowing and I sort of couldn't. I mean, it was just completely sort of experimental, and he did a lot of this. He did these also interesting tests of our reaction times and testing boys' reaction times, but it wasn't connecting to me the sort of the scientific world that was being explained to me by my grandfather, I guess, of mathematics and the stars and mechanics and so on. So, but only later on did I begin to sort of, read it much later. I understand all these sort of connections of area of science I come from and biology and so on. But I sort of said one of the most more profound experiences was the fact that for 2 holidays when my parents again were away in South Africa, in Italy, I went to stay with a great uncle in Scotland, and he's arguably one of the most you probably kings don't recognise this, but one of his most important king's scientists of the last century, called Lewis Richardson, and Lewis Richardson. Then he did science here in King's in 1904 or 5, but then he used to go. He met my great uncle who was killed in the First World War, Stuart Guy, as did a famous scientist in King and Trinity called Julian Hunt. They always used to go to the Isle of Wight in the same sort of place where my grandparents were. And then Lewis Richardson married my great aunt, and that's why he was in our family. Why he's very famous is because he sort of invented kinds of mathematics that use weather forecasting. He wrote the first book on how you do mathematics and sort of weather forecasting, and then he switched and he applied mathematics to the study of war and psychology and so on. Extraordinary man. So we stayed with him, and suddenly we saw this. We stayed with this man. So he continued to be a kind of experimental and very innovative science to the end. And he invented fractals, for example, and people still talk about in scientific circles and the things he was doing. At the time I was there as a boy, where he would throw all these parsnips into the lake in Scotland and see how rapidly it moved apart as a form of sort of relative diffusion. And so we stayed with this man. So I was 11 or something, and my brother was there, so he was 10. And he said we were going to go out to the village shop to get some paint to paint his house. But before we did that, we had to do an experiment to see what sort of paint it was. So he brought some samples back, and then he had a little chemical lab and started pouring some sulfuric acid in. Some of these paints sort of withstood this chemical onslaught. Others sort of started bubbling and filled the whole house in these terrible fumes. And it was just sort of magic. It was extraordinary. And every morning he used to get up and he would be taking notes from the radio. And I said, why are you doing that? He said, well, you can't believe anything you read in newspapers, can you? You've got to believe the BBC. And it was sort of quite something to be sort of told by somebody that a lot of things you're being told are completely misleading, and you will be very careful. And the point about him was that, so many things he did were things people all believed, like they knew the length of the frontier of the country. They didn't actually, because it depends on how closely you measure it. You'll get
Fractals,
fractals, exactly. So he didn't believe anything until he'd sort of done it. So this was an extraordinary vision. It is a very to get that idea that you've really got to test what you see, and you can be very suspicious. And I think perhaps you can gather already from my stories, I was a rather suspicious person about things, and if I saw a master doing something, I was suspicious about it. I didn't accept it as an authority figure. And so this naturally resonated with this sort of slightly contrarian outsider view of the world, which I think to some extent scientists have to have. And then he showed us all the Times newspapers he stored during World War II because he wanted to cross-reference them. He gave up after about 3 days. But anyway, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. So one of the things is that one of the things I did, two of his famous books, which were published by CUP didn't want them. He had to pay CUP to publish them, which are now sort of world kind of famous books. Even then, when we got all these people together to collect these collected papers, and CUP was going to publish them. I don't mind if you put this on the record, but CUP knows this. Again, there was some sort of trickeries going on, and I had to really sort of bend and push the syndics. And they did publish these fantastic collected works of Richardson, and they, of course, all sold. Anyway, that was a really extraordinary experience.
Two absolutely final questions about the dragon. One was, I've got this memory of a little boy there. I think his name may have been Collins.
That's right, yes, sir.
He had polio, and he used to be either on crutches or in a wheelchair. And I seem to remember he was bullied somewhat. I mean, later on, not so much, but I seem to remember people used to taunt him because he couldn't chase after them and so on. I'm sure I was implicit in this. Do you remember that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was very uncomfortable with him. I mean, he wasn't treated well, and he reacted, of course, to that. He was in some classes I was in, and he was in the schoolhouse. I think actually he was pretty stoic, actually,
Yes.
as I recall the situation.
I had a sense of humour, and later I became friends, but I think early on I think it was...
Yeah, no, I think it was very nice as well then. But what was interesting, just to come back, I mean, the other interesting thing was that Boys and Dragons were really remarkable, really, how interested we were in politics. I mean, for example, the American presidential election of 1952, Ike versus Stevens, boys would go around dragon school saying, "I like Ike," on their thing. It was amazing. And every day, all the common rooms had newspapers. We used to read them. And the Korean War was going on, I suppose. The masters in one school that formed us in Upper 3A, every day we had some question that we had to go and answer from the newspapers. So it was quite now that is very unusual now. I mean, the ignorance of even people, undergraduates is astonishing, But we were very political, And the general elections we had. I always remember a marvellous debate between the person who spoke on behalf of the Conservatives, called Guinness, of the Guinnesses, and this. It's still sad to recall Francis Hope. I don't remember him, and he was a brilliant writer, and he then wrote a lot on the New Statesman, and he was killed in that awful air crash from Paris. So they were very high moments, and nothing like that I think happens now in schools, hardly at all in Britain. So I don't know whether that was the school or whether that was the period. But it's
well, one of the masters was a member of the Communist Party, or
Brown. J.B. Brown. That's right. That was also very, very shocking. He just shut his eyes during prayers. Everybody else. So he looked around and he was sort of sitting there, and he didn't wear a tie. So he always wore a navy Airtex shirt, which is open at the top, you see, and
he produced all the Gilbert and Sullivan.
Also with an open Airtex shirt when he was conducting. I was always very sort of conscious of this. sartorial kind of deviation.
One other memory, one of the things I enjoy most was those games we had in the evening. I'm not sure whether it was Dover Patrol or something else, where we used to get torches and huge spotlights, and you'd have two teams
Yes.
and try and get to the other side. We used to play it in the hall
Yes.
and out on the field. Do you remember that?
Oh yes. Well, there were these these sort of people, these ex-army sort of torches that people had, and they did it across the playground. Well, one of the things that the other unique, sort of remarkable thing about dragons, which connects to this, was the fact that they had prefects, you see, and so you became a prefect, and then I was invited to become head of house. You see. It was one of the interesting things. I was invited in this letter from Jock, the headmaster. Did I want to become head of house on my own, or with another boy? You see, or with another person? So I said, "Oh, certainly we'll share. Together." But your role, you had absolutely zero power, except you were called a prefect. And during these kind of turbulent evenings, when it was dark and sort of between tea and supper over the weekend, there was no particular control. Your job was to sort of reduce the level of mayhem, and find out what was going on. So I used to use my brother as a sort of spy to say, "Tell me what's going on," and try to reduce the sort of chaos. And but also you had this role of then speaking on Sundays at the service, speaking the report of the service and doing readings and so on. So that was quite an interesting experience. That one of sort of leadership, kind of leadership without power, much, and that was sort of very Dragons' as well. I think one learned a bit from that.
I came across a letter of my mother's my last year saying Alan has now got a study, and he's asked me to send him some pin-ups for the wall from health and efficiency, or ladies in bathing costumes. I was quite shocked. She was quite shocked too. I couldn't imagine that Dragon allowing you to have ladies pinned up on your study wall, but this brought back the fact that we did, but I can't remember.
They did. Oh yes, there was a sort of study we had, and I didn't do that, but they were certainly there on the wall.
So at the end of it, you got a scholarship?
No, I didn't get a scholarship. No, I didn't. No, I was in Upper One, but I didn't. I applied for Westminster, and well, as I said, I was sort of quite ill during that time. But I got a place at Westminster, and it was. So that's right. No, because actually I got the place the previous summer. That's right. In before I was 13. That's right. I took the entrance exam to Westminster. I also took a scholarship exam to St Paul's. That's right. In summer of '54. That's right. I didn't get a scholarship at St Paul's. I had an entrance, but I got an entrance at Westminster. I took the scholarship, and but they were very formidable exams. And what was so extraordinary was you had these optional papers in Latin verse and Greek verse. And it was formidable. And Dragons, and they still do that. That's cool. Anyway, I got into Westminster, and I was in sort of top class stream when I was there, and I was a day boy when I first started at Westminster. My parents were in London at the time, and but it was a very difficult time because I was very ill, and so much so that sort of many of the nights I just couldn't sleep, and my father used to read to me, and this shattering pain, and all the doctors said it was growing pains and this and that and so on. And but eventually I went to another doctor, a sort of distant relative, who started pressing vertebrae on my back, and suddenly he pressed one and I jumped in the air, and he obviously said that was a kind of, still extraordinary. A lot of doctors never ever feel the body. And some do, some don't. Anyway, he did that and found out. And then then it was a very, why I mention this, because it was a very formative experience to me in my, in my sense of my feelings towards being sort of left-wing and left of centre was to then go to a Queen's Square Hospital for nervous diseases. If you say to most people you're in Queen's Square Hospital for nervous diseases, they look at you twice or if not 3 times, because they're primarily people go there for serious mental problems. But in fact it's a hospital for nervous diseases. So I was so here I was, aged 13 and a half, in a ward of 27 people, many of whom were seriously mentally disturbed. Many of them were injured from the war still. I mean, it was quite a striking hospital full of that. And so blind people crashing up and down. In the mornings you had sometimes people dead, they died in the night, and then the nurses would say, wakey, 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 Judge! And the other people around the ward say, he's dead, you know? So it was life in the raw, really.
My first term at Westminster.
The first time at Westminster.
Yeah.
When I was then commuting from my parents' house in Putney on the tube every day. And I was in a class in Mr. Lushington, and so I enjoyed the feeling of being in London. But again, it was a house with a sort of even though it was a day boy house with a structure of prefects and so on. I was soon in the sort of thick of fighting and arguing, and I found myself pushing on a door with 3 other boys, and not knowing the other side of the door was the prefect and all the prefects. and then we sort of released quickly, and all the prefects tumbled in, lying on the floor. This was not a good beginning to sort of. So I was given various sort of hard tasks to clean all the sort of college silver over the weekend or something, and bullying. A little bit of bullying. But no, despite this, in fact, I was rather ill, and as I was just saying, I then went into hospital for those 4 weeks at the Queen's Square Hospital, where there were all sorts of cases. One of the most extraordinary cases was this boy who came in who had obviously had some terrible thing in his brain, and at night he used to be at the end of the ward shouting, "They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace," the AA building. And everybody used to shout, "Shut up, shut up," until finally the doctors had to come in and hit and punch it and give it a rattling injection. We used to hear that they're changing guards. Anyway, but it was very new technology then. They were able to give me a lumbar puncture and a myelogram and put me on an X-ray table, which was quite uncomfortable, and go up and down to nearly vertical. And then you could see on the X-ray this kind of white, like a white Nile, which is your spine. In the middle of it is a big black hole, which was a tumour. All of which was shown to me. So I was 13, and then they said, well, we're going to try and get that out. But they didn't tell me what they told my parents, was that there's only a certain chance of being able to get it out, and if we don't get it out, we're going to die. They just told me we're going to try and get it out, so it was very difficult for my parents. And then I went to another hospital where I had this surgery, and they did get it out. I was obviously very fortunate because it was on the outside of the spinal column. And but the point was, this would be causing me terrible pain because it had been pressing on the nerve that went all the way. So then I was in a ward then with extraordinary sort of veterans of Dieppe, who sort of told me terrible stories through the night. And then there were sort of working class lorry drivers, told me all sorts of stories about their life. This lorry driver, his last day in the hospital before he was discharged was to clean his teeth one last time and take the toothbrush and throw it out the window. He said, I haven't cleaned my teeth for 20 years and I'm not going to clean my teeth for another 20 years. But what was so traumatic for me was having had this operation, I then couldn't lift my head. And so they said, well, you've got to start again because we've taken all the muscles from your back, you've got to develop your muscles. So I'm supporting my neck today on my side muscles here, and not on the muscles on the back of my neck because they were all taken away. So I quickly developed quite a large neck as I was sort of expanding this. But again, it was I think living with people and understanding and talking with them was an experience.
And you said it sort of led to your interest in left-wing
I think it
politics.
did. I think it did because always, as I've mentioned to you before, I was sort of interested in the stories of the aspects of the people who were in a difficult situation, and this was made it more natural. And then while I was at Westminster, of course, my parents were abroad. I spent some amount of time with my aunt Peggy J, my mother's sister, and she was married to Douglas J, who was in cabinet in the Labour government up to 51, and then he joined the Labour government again in the 60s. So I used to go and visit them at Hampstead at the weekends, and I met my cousins Peter and Martin J, who was very important for me. And so we used to talk. She used to talk a bit about Labour politics, and I began to sort of take a lot of interest in that. And again, as a boarder, I don't know whether this is true with you, etc., but we used to read a lot of politics, and partly I used to go down to the House of Commons sometimes, and this was the period of Suez. For example, Suez 1956 was very extraordinary. We used to listening to first of all the government's speech on the radio that they were going to go and attack Suez, and then listening to the leader of the opposition saying, this is a period of war, but normally the opposition supports the government, but we are absolutely opposed to this. And then hearing on Fridays at Westminster, we were in the course, and we had all this sort of military stuff walking up and down, and we had the brigade of guards, sergeant majors, shouting at us on Friday afternoon, "Hey, Bob! With very, very loud voices." And then we'd have lectures about, when we weren't taking Bren guns apart, on Friday. We used to go to these field trips and we used to learn how to shoot a Bren gun. It's an astonishing thing to shooting a big machine gun at age 16, 15, and the reaction is astonishing. And then we'd hear about, I was actually explaining this to the other day, the stories of exactly what was happening in the Suez War. We told about, the fact that the American fleet went in front of the British fleet and said, "What do you think you're doing?" It was an extraordinary event, So during my lifetime, we had Suez when the Americans were against the Brits, and then we had Vietnam, where the Brits didn't support the Americans, and we had the Falklands, and now we have Iraq. It's so actually, they're studying through the life. There've been these quite big events. Well, that's the perspective I had on it. But anyway, so this whole funny place of being at Westminster School with Parliament on one side, brigade of guards sort of shouting at you on the other side, going down and sort of shooting Bren guns on Friday afternoons here. It was, you felt you were part of some governmental system, and you were controlling yourself, the world, and you were going to be part of all this, and then we had these sort of political sessions, these political society sessions with. I remember quizzing. There was a curious man called Lord Althorpe who used to write about whether we needed to be a republic or not. So we used to debate that, and Ted Heath came. But perhaps one of the most interesting moments was when C.P. Snow came, and that was a very, very interesting event. What he said was that us British, are all very narrow-minded, and I've just been to Russia. Where no Russian physicist would be able to pass his exams unless he could also pass a very detailed written paper on War and Peace from the character, write about the character of Natasha in War and Peace or something. It was quite striking. Actually, I found it very stimulating. So I sort of quickly thought, my God, I must read my War and Peace, Dostoevsky and Austin, which I did, and it was quite. So it was a school. It was a school that made you feel that you should take an interest and participate, and you were up to it in all these aspects of public life. And again, one sees this a lot. Children, in fact, in all countries of the world, children who are not brought up in capital cities feel politics quite alien generally, and there's only very few children from provinces who actually sort of feel it's natural for them to enter politics. It was a high proportion, a much disproportionate proportion of children field politics and public affairs are for them if you're brought up in a capital city. I mean, Dragons was unusual at Oxford and Cambridge. There's been more of that, but so that was a strong feature. But the other feature of being at Westminster really was that I did have some sort of splendid teachers in particularly in mathematics. I had a great German teacher called Adolf Prague, who'd come from being in Central Europe, but he came over and taught, and we had a very small class. You see, in those days, the mathematics 6th at Westminster had 4 boys in it. There were 27 in classics, you see. Now it's the other way around, more or less. And we had another master who sort of teach us a lot about mechanics, and physics teachers who sort of spent a lot of time talking out of school. And it was and it was at that time that I became quite, in my same class was Dan Mackenzie, one of the colleagues in King's, and one of the better moments. I know you like to tell stories about your other interviews, but one of the better moments was in the divinity class, which was unusually given by a vicar or a canon from Westminster. So he went out of the class and said, "Who believes in God?" You see, and most boys, this is generally not what you do ask in a divinity class in a public school. So, although we all, of course, went to chapel every day, and it was very beautiful in Westminster Abbey, having singing Te Deums and hymns, and one knew them, and it was sort of an tremendous aesthetic and obviously semi-religious experience. But then actually learning, being asked to sort of talk about the Bible and biblical matters, generally you're not asked to your particular faith in that part. But anyway, on this occasion we were asked, and they, most of us hummed and hawed, as it were, and said, well, sometimes, and I wonder about this, I'm not quite sure. But then they came to Dan Mackenzie, and they said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "No." So the vicar said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I am a scientist." So we all said, "Oh, Dan, how can you be so sort of naive and sort of, Anyway, he was very emphatic about it. And of course, Dan's quite a friend, and we had holidays together later on. But we were a very strong group of scientists, and already socially, which is a feature of that school, and it still is a school. The scientific bodies are very close together, and the humanities people are. And although we had studies and so on, one was beginning to diverge, beginning to separate into these sort of subgroups. But one of the interesting things, looking back on it, which I think you tell this to people now that are really surprised about, is that we were emphatically told that it would be impossible to be a scientist unless you became really fluent in German, because this was the 50s, German. And even when I had, as an undergraduate, I had vacation jobs in ICI. They said, "You've got to learn German. You can't possibly sort of get anywhere in science unless you speak German and understand German," and so on and so on. Which, of course, just completely disappeared. I mean, in the United States in the 60s, all graduate students had to learn 2 foreign languages, or many of them tried to learn Russian and German, or read it, all of that has now disappeared. So it was, you didn't feel, as a scientist, that being English was, you were the dominant culture, which is quite important. Whereas now everybody, it's almost a limitation of children now that you're English, and the English is the dominant culture. It might not be forever with the Chinese going. But anyway, so Westminster, my parents were abroad much of the time, and I had one holiday in Malaya, and that was a tremendous experience. Or 2 holidays in Malaya, as it was then called. My father was deputy high commissioner. And again, this was a period in which there was sort of war going on. There was the fighting with the Chinese guerrillas. So there was a lot of security and arms, and we had one of my cousins actually was in the National Service, so we learned about that. but it was interesting seeing being in a country that was developing, going into independence. But I did a sort of student project when I was there.
How old were you?
So by that time I was 17. I did a project there, in which I toured around all these villages in Malaya, trying to study how the smallholdings were behaving relative to rubber growth and the changing economy. So I actually found this essay the other day, and I was sort of like, I suppose I was somewhat of an article in The Economist or something, but it was based upon lots of interviews and studying it. So I was, well, I think as you can see, although I was very interested in science, I was very interested in these wider political matters and connections together. And obviously being with my father, who was the British Deputy High Commissioner, we had a lot of discussions. One of the funniest moments, which I did get described in my father's obituary, was this tremendous problem in Malaya. They became independent in August 1957. I was there for the summer holidays, and by July, they still had not got a national anthem. and the point was they had a competition, an open competition for a national anthem. And one of the people who had entered was Benjamin Britten. So Benjamin Britten had sent in this competition about 6 months earlier to the Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman. And my father was a very good pianist. He played something on Radio Malaya. And so the Tunku came round to my father's house with sort of outriders and motor bicyclists and so on, and asked him, would he play this piece of Benjamin Britten's? So my father and the Tunku, the Prime Minister, sat on my father's piano stool and played this draft national anthem. And they looked at each other and said, "This will not do." so they then made some suggestions how it might be changed. Can you imagine? And sent this back to Benjamin Britten, who was not amused. And so there was actually ended up with some sort of legal case from the Foreign Office of Benjamin Britten as to how much money he should be paid for this. So anyway, so by July there was no answer. So they had this brilliant idea of taking a very popular dance tune and slowing it down, and that worked very well. But it was quite an occasion there because actually the Duke of Gloucester flew out and President Queen's uncle to hand over independence, and his son, who was later on undergraduate at Cambridge, who sadly died in a plane crash. I was sort of friendly with him. So it was quite an occasion seeing the flag. I hadn't thought of seeing the flag going down or marching, and so having been to India. In fact, my father's career, and I've obviously reflected it. This sort of post-colonial life, post-colonial events, have sort of coloured the sort of world that we've been in, and at that time it was sort of interesting, really. It was all kind of somewhat looking backwards, and this was the world of the wars and the empire decay. What was coming next? And I think I feel sort of jumping forwards. I think more than perhaps many of my colleagues, and it's still regrettably I think more than many of my colleagues in my generation. I sort of changed to this tremendous upward. Sort of embracing Europe. I mean, that's for those of us who have embraced Europe, which is a minority, I would say, intellectually, intellectuals and so on, in a sort of total way. That has been the sort of change in our life. So I've slightly been drawing this picture of looking backwards at Germany and the wars and the end of empire. But actually, by the time we began to be here in Cambridge in the 60s and 70s, the European adventure, was beginning. And I was a bit of a skeptic to start with, but I think once that's sort of taken off, I think for many people that is. But sadly, there is not still a sort of majority sort of view, I would say, and they haven't embraced this. This is the marvelous thing about Britain. We are part of Europe in a very kind of connected way. Anyway, but that was sort of that was Westminster, and
Can I just
Yeah.
follow up one thing at Westminster? This was Dan Mackenzie's "No, I don't believe in God," and because I'm a scientist. I often ask people about Richard Dawkins and whether science and religion are compatible and so on, and what their own faith and beliefs are more generally.
Yes.
How would you place yourself as now or over your life? Have you moved away from religion towards religion? It's all irrelevant, or what?
Well, no, I'm afraid to say I'm as I sort of was indicating, a sort of a semi-aesthetic, semi-non-believer, really, a semi-believer, semi-believer, I suppose. I can't accept the bleakness of this. Just here we are as this extraordinary sort of event in sort of biochemistry and physics, and which is sort of from one intellectual side of the brain, so this is all we are. So I sort of slightly, as it were, I've sort of become I suppose intuitively sort of intuitive systems person. I mean, we actually, by sometimes going to church, by sometimes having semi-religious social things together, we create good feelings about ourselves. We work together better. Sort of surprising things come out of it for ourselves and for our community, and we sort of relate to how it was in the past. So it's not an understood, rationally understood set of beliefs and reactions, but I find that somewhere near where I am. So somehow or other, we said the Lord's Prayer, for 60 years or something. It's by saying it again with others, like when they open prayers at the House of Lords, which I attend sometimes. It's you feel part of something in your past and connected. I mean, it probably is not very different to singing the football song of Arsenal, because you've done that for all your life. But I didn't do that. But I did go to church and say the Lord's Prayer, and that's my Arsenal. But so I don't go into it a lot further than that. I just sort of see the alternative as us as a set of individuals in this way is sort of too bleak, really. And I find, culturally we're part of this sort of church, sort of semi-Christian world, and so like many others, I'm sort of semi-part of it.
Let's perhaps go on now to Trinity, Cambridge. You presumably entered to do science straight away at Trinity.
Yes.
Why did you go to Trinity? Your father was there? Or?
Oh no, I went to Trinity. Well, first of all, Westminster had this. So if you're in the Maths 6th, I mean, you were progressing from Stevenage to Baldock to Westminster. Anybody who, that was sort of where you were headed, if you were sort of considered to be plausible. And Trinity Westminster had this connection with Christ Church, Oxford, and that was mainly for classicists. If you were a scientist, you were sort of headed for Trinity. That was sort of kind of the way it was, really. But in my case, I had a stronger connection because my grandfather had been a fellow at Trinity, and my uncle had been here, and so on. But not only my grandfather, but his two brothers had all been at Trinity before the First World War. So that was sort of where I went to. But before I went to Westminster, I had this sort of kind of other great sort of social experience of having my time out, in which I worked on a building site in Cardiff for 4 or 5 months as a sort of because I got this place to be engineering as a training engineer, and that was really an extraordinary experience. So I lived in a small council house in Cardiff, and went down in this sort of truck every day. I was paid 1.11 an hour, which is not a lot of money, and a lot of money. So I got £8 a week, board and lodging and pay, and I was able to save £4 a week, which was quite extraordinary. But so this was a very raw, very cold site there in Cardiff on the docks, and they were building one and then you had all these workers coming in, and you saw these extraordinary kind of, you know, industrial relations. You saw a foreman punching people in the nose to kind of behave, and so I remonstrated with him. As you can see, I was a difficult person. He said, "Well, Julian," he said, and this is an American, "I'm trying to build an oil refinery, not have a popularity contest." You know, and his other remark was that as I went on with my theodolite, you know, measuring the arm, I said, "Look, you know, you've got to straighten this wall here, you see." He said, "You know, we're trying to build an oil refinery, not an effing watch," he said. so I learned about the art of approximation, and it was very interesting actually, because I was on a site as a engineer. I was sort of already trying to, you know, understand, you know, the maths and the science and the volumes of the stone and so on, and in relation to what these people were doing. So I thought that was all very interesting. And then then I also learned, because it's a very primitive place, and it still is. You know, it's a very primitive sort of almost sort of warlike place, of pressures of people who come and go, and so I had this huge black person who carried around the theodolite and stuff with me, sort of semi-escort. And when if you had to get a lot of people who just got piecework for building a brick wall, and then you tell them you've got to take it down, they're not very happy. So I would say something, and then he would say, "You heard what he said." and he said, but as he left, he said, I've got one piece of advice for you, Julian. He said, very, very important. He said, if you have children, always have them by the same woman, he said, because that way you get family allowance. Because in the 1960s, you see, you only got family allowance for the second and subsequent children. And he said he had 3 children by 3 different women, and he was getting no family allowance. I mean, that didn't come in until the Labour government of 1974, I think. You know. It was a very long time in coming. It didn't come in even with the first Wilson government. You know. Anyway, but the point was that if you've been that actually is quite a formative period before you come to Trinity. It's quite different for a boy, from someone who's just come from school. So, so I had some very realistic ideas about society, you know, or quite, I think, reasonably realistic society. So when I then, for example, came to Trinity, and I was very interested in engineering, and I did that. But I quickly joined this society in Cambridge, which is extraordinary to think about, called the Human Relations and Industry Group, and I became the secretary and the president. This was run by the old professor, the Montague Burton Professor of Industrial Relations, which I still think still exists. And King, Professor Kirkcaldy, King's. And we used to have these amazing, so it was sort of, a lot of engineers were involved in it, because in those days it was a terrific ideal. To be an engineer, you were going to be a manager. That was the thing, you know. Industry was this sort of semi-war-like zone, you know, the big problems of men and workers and so on. And how could you be an engineer unless you thought about that? So we all had these evenings in which it was amazing. We had the shop stewards from the shipyards, and we had these managers, and then they would argue, you know, and then all go back in the car together to London. But that was a very big issue. And what happened? It was quite a sudden change happened in Cambridge. Was that suddenly management suddenly became a sort of technical business of moving money around, and it became managers talking to managers. You know, I mean, the only people who then brought shop stewards to Cambridge after that was the Socialist Workers' Party or something. You know, whereas before that, it was, you know, this was a sort of key issue, and so that was one part of being an engineer in Cambridge. And, you know, we used to have these meetings, and many of the people at the meetings were people reading engineering, because they saw that. Whereas now the engineers are all going to go to the city, or they're going to, you know, the idea they've actually got to tell people what to do and get them to get along together is completely, you know, very far away from their business. So that was a sort of, in some sense, Cambridge being, you know, a real world, you know, connection in Cambridge. I went to the Labour Party in Cambridge because of my interest, and I found that very, very. I despite the sort of practical seriousness of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on, I mean, the kind of undergraduate politics was puerile, I felt.
Was Raymond Williams, involved by that time or not?
Yeah, he was here. I mean, but he didn't come to meetings very much. He was writing. I read his book, Culture and Society. It was a very interesting book.
Because he was quite active at some point in the Labour, because someone I've interviewed, Lisa Jardine, was very influenced by him and through the Labour Club and so on. Perhaps that's later or... no, it must be about the same time.
It was about the same time. I'm very sorry. I mean, I read his book, but it seemed to be a lot of his my experience, me and my experience. As you can see, I was already, I'm afraid, concerned with what happens there. I mean, what happened to me was not so important, but what happened to there. And a lot of people in the Labour Party, it was all part of their own kind of passage, of understanding themselves. And so I suppose you would say I was an instrumentalist, though. What's the problem? Let's deal with the problem. So I found that kind of difficult, really. And there was a man called Williams who was very active, a different Williams, physicist. I think it was a personal kind of thing. It wasn't for me. In fact, I only got sort of really interested, saw politics as real, when I went to America as a postdoc in 1967. But I just finished. So Trinity. Yes. So Trinity. I was.
Who were you taught by?
I was taught by. It was a funny, extraordinary old man called Mr. Binney in Trinity. He was a sort of an old-fashioned sort of hydraulics engineer, and we used to go for walks with him on Sundays over the fens and talk about the draining of the fens and so on. Actually, that was a very interesting thing. One very much felt we were sort of part of the fens, and talking about that. And there were some other. I mean, they were not superstars. Any of them, I would say. I mean, the only sort of superstar in the engineering department was this man Baker, the head of engineering, who used to address in a sort of a traditional, I would say, sort of James Robertson Justice kind of way, all the engineering undergraduates in the first days. He said, "What you've got to remember now, you can't play sport every afternoon," he said. Because he assumed we were all public school boys and we'd all play sport every afternoon. We've got to wean ourselves from this frightful kind of addiction. But he was quite a character. He built all these sort of bomb shelters in World War II. And there were still some teachers, who talked about, when I was in the Western Desert and my electric motor broke down, I had to remember my first minute. So the idea was that, you would be in some outlandish position, in the Empire, on the Western Desert, and you've got to remember your engineering. I mean, it was still quite looking backwards, It was it was a million miles from kind of, electronics and all of that. But the marvelous stuff, what I enjoyed, and then just to I wrote this article in this Trinity magazine thing. So we had one of my professors, Michael Shirtley, who I liked very much, and I then went to become a research student with him. And he talked about these sort of really the modern ideas of connecting up gases and magnetic fields. And so, for example, people were sort of pumping liquid sodium around nuclear reactors, and it was an increasingly new sort of technology. But he was also commenting how the Americans were using this technology to try to control the way rockets would land on Moscow or wherever. But if they applied this technology as a joke, they hadn't got it quite right. You'd just be dropping magnets on Moscow instead of bombs. But that was quite amusing to me, this idea of teaching by humour and by lateralness. And in fact, I think as a subsequent teacher, it was probably a disaster, because one of the things I quickly learned was that lecturers I liked, almost nobody else liked, and vice versa, and one of the curious things about lecturing, that it's very bipolar, a class can be really liked by a third of the class and hated by two-thirds of the class, or vice versa.
Well, I always get one or two who say these are the worst lectures I've ever been to, and everyone else saying they really enjoyed them.
Well, sometimes it's more than that with me, but anyway, I could tell that as a student, But anyway, he was. I mean, there's the Christmas tree approach, all these lateral branches. And now some people really just don't want a Christmas tree. They just want to have the sort of pole up the middle, you know, from A to B. So that was quite that was inspiring, and the notion that it connected up, and that engineering, you know, was not a series of disciplines, but it was a sort of tremendously interconnected. And the other interesting thing, which is again unique to, almost unique to the UK, I still think, you know, was the sort of being taught in the lab. I mean, so you know, on your first week or two, you were in the lab, but the lecturers were in the lab there, and somehow being taught or discussing principles while huge flywheels were going over the water, was going down the flumes and so on. I mean, it was magnificent. I mean, it was kind of an experience.
Where was that? There wasn't the
This was the engineering department.
Ah, yes.
And we still had terrible old flywheel gas engines that were going back from 1905. I mean, they were incredibly old. Forgetting ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. But it was, as teaching the principles, it was tremendous. And you had this environment, slightly oily, and the great big flywheels and noise, and it was actually quite fun, really. You know?
Nowadays it would just be computers and nothing.
Yes. No, so it was quite.
How did you find the social side of Trinity? I mean, it's a very affluent and well-heeled.
Well, I mean, you know, in my year, there were 30 old Etonians and there were 10 old Westminsters, and there were old Etonians then, as there are now, who walk around in trilby hats and gumboots, you know, as it were, and they sort of, and it was even more funny when I came back as a Don, when they treat. I mean, a Don, I think, to a sort of posh Trinity person is, I don't know, somewhere between an under gamekeeper and a sort of, you know, floor sweeper. I don't quite know where you are, but you're definitely very low in their concept of a Don. I mean, a Don. And so they would. It was rather amusing because they treated this place as a sort of, you know, the important thing was beagling at the weekends, and they treated Dons.
Was the Trinity Foot still
Oh
going
yes,
down?
absolutely. Yeah. So I thought we just dressed up in their clothes. So that was quite amusing, and they treated you as a sort of, you know, kind of, you know, as a scientist, as sort of, you know, kind of. I played soccer with a lot of these people, you know. Each of them, because he plays soccer, actually has the mix with the proletariat is much more than people from some other schools, and so we had very sort of mixed classes. We mixed football with some old Italians and some church in Nottingham Grammar, so I regarded it as all part of the pageantry of life. Really, and it was having this extraordinary range of people, and in fact, it was very friendly. I mean, because I'm actually, you know, sitting there having breakfast and meeting people. I met some of my closest friends were reading philosophy and English and history, and we spent a lot of time actually in each other's rooms talking, and somehow films were going part. You know, we used to go to the arts theatre and go to sort of Italian films, so I really enjoyed this sort of social life of Cambridge. I went on a football tour after my first term with all these extraordinary mixed bag of people in the Trinity soccer team, you know, from all different walks and tough parts of England. We went to Vienna. I hitchhiked to Vienna and saw all sorts of things on the way. So I find all that, you know, it was tremendously exciting, really.
Perhaps a point where I'll always ask people whether they feel that they, in terms of creativity, whether they feel that the collegiate system, which does mean that you're sitting next to historians and others, has had an effect on the way they think about the interconnections between things in their work.
Yeah, no, I think, funnily enough, I think the collegiate system works very, very well for undergraduates. I think it's a near disaster for many types of actual academic life subsequently. Having moved from Trinity to University College London, I mean, I just see that as just, and having seen American universities which obviously don't have colleges, I see that as having huge advantages. I mean, the curious thing about the collegiate system is that it's a curious thing, you have this sort of conversation at lunch, but then people go back to their departments, and then there are these sort of frightful silos. But in a funny way, you know, if you don't have colleges, you know, interdepartmental connections are stronger. There's another feature of Cambridge, which it seems to me is that it prides itself tremendously on intellectual prowess, and not say ownership. You know, whereas if you're in an empirical, not say utilitarian place like university college, you know, where you just sort of judge knowledge more by its use and its connections. You know, it has a very different style. So I think you know, at some level it's. I mean, I felt very privileged when I went back to Trinity as a fellow, because I was of the era when a lot of the fellows had outside careers, E.H. Carr, and Vivian, and many of these people, obviously Otto. I forgot his name. I've got the great physicist Frisch, he lived in Germany.
Otto Frisch.
So the colleges were fantastic because they came from all sorts of different walks, and I think my view, I'm afraid, is that Cambridge's recruitment policy has been quite narrow. Trinity is extremely narrow, and progressively, I think the colleges have become far too sort of inward, and I think disappointing in many ways. And I think Cambridge's position in the world, you know, might not be. I mean, I think its high reputation might be perhaps based on past glories, and so unless there's a very firm policy in the colleges and universities to keep recruiting people who have experiences outside, you know, it's a system that becomes too cosy at the top level. But as for undergraduates, I think it's fantastic. So I enjoyed that, but then I saw this extraordinary change. But it was very insular. I mean, that was the other one. It was very English, very male. You know, at that time there were no girls in Trinity. So I met a young Italian girl, courtesy of some boys from chaps in Kings, and I enjoyed seeing her. And quite platonic, we had a lot of times together, and then I went to see her and her family in Rome, and then I met my present wife, through friends of my parents, and sort of see her. But it was a pretty male life, really. And on Fridays and Saturdays at the train station, we used to saw all these girls coming down, and it was a strange sort of strange kind of life, actually. But then I became so, you know, I was studying, and I spent during that time I did sort of traveling in Europe, and became more and more sort of enjoyed Europe. And as I say, as a schoolboy, I was very didn't like my French, and I sort of why would I ever want to go to the continent? And you know, I sort of kind of it's a tremendous sort of switch, which I sort of enjoyed going to Europe and traveled all over, and traveled to Germany particularly, which nowadays young people hardly ever go to Germany. It's quite strange. And then I had this sort of, you know, decision what to do when I finished. One option, you know, was to do, which is what I was thinking of to start with. In fact, I went a long way down the road, was to train to become a civil engineer. Because one of my vacations, I went to Pakistan when my father was a diplomat, and I saw these extraordinary large schemes of dams and irrigation and the need for those kind of things. And I thought that's what my career was going to be. So I thought I was going to go to America and learn about that and have a career as a civil engineer. But I met my wife, and you know, I couldn't have gone there. So I decided to switch and be a research student in Cambridge. And I'm very pleased about that decision. And so I did that with my supervisor, Shirtcliffe, in sort of the new technology of magnetic fields, which people thought was going to be a new way of improving the efficiency of power stations. You know, you use very hot gases, and you push them through a magnetic field before they then ran a boiler to take the turbines. But it was a very exciting sort of period of being sort of huge money spent experiments, and I had a sort of industrial scholarship to pay for me while I was doing my PhD on this sort of subject. but in doing so, there was a sort of new mathematics to be done, and that was interesting. So I started that, and then after 1 year, my professor then got this job as being head of engineering in Warwick, you know, at the University of Warwick. So it was very funny. Trinity, always Trinity. I said, "You're leaving Cambridge, you're throwing your Cambridge career." Oh dear, oh dear. Anyway, so I went to Warwick. It was, you know, it was marvelous really. We got married, and we lived in a Tudor cottage near Kenilworth Castle. And I worked in an aircraft factory. There was no university, so once again I was back to the sort of, you know, we did all these experiments in the part of the Bristol City aircraft factory in downtown Coventry. And my wife, who designed textile design, she was the wardrobe mistress in the Belgrade Theatre, which is a very progressive theatre in the 60s, where they put on all these plays, and Sophie and I met these famous actors, you know, and can you imagine, this was the 60s, so on these, whereas in London in the 60s, all the theatres were about, you know, who's for tennis, and they came through the kind of, you know, the doors of the drawing room and so on, the Sicily Courtenage and so on. In Coventry, you know, they were doing, you know, Arnold Wesker and then classical things and so on. But then, at the end of the theatre, the first night of the theatre, you'd have a conversation between the audience, you know, and the actors and the directors and so on, so public discussion and so on. It was amazing, you know. And on one famous occasion, well, to me, was that the Minister of Culture, Jenny Lee, came and chaired the discussion at the end of "Lock Up Your Daughters," which was a great production. My wife had done all the stage, and then the Guardian, the next thing, not only described the discussion afterwards, and said at the end of this discussion, a man in a duffel coat stood up at the back of the room and asked that question. And that was me, but I forgot what the question was. But anyway, in fact, this even appears in Jenny Lee's biography. I think this anonymous question in a duffel coat.
Obviously penetrating.
So it was. And can you imagine? And I used to come back in the evenings after having supper with my wife at the terrible kind of civic canteen in Coventry, to go to my lab, and I'd go past the police station, who periodically would ask me to appear on an identity parade for the prince. So I sort of saw life. So I did. What's interesting, you know, I didn't skirt around these things, and I sort of appreciated it. So I've sort of been interested in, you know, society from top to bottom. So when I anyway, so I did a PhD, and it was very exciting. It was very new science, and I gave seminars on what I'd done all around the place. I went. It was very interesting. I think science works. So I gave a seminar, for example, at University College after my first 4 terms, and they were very excited by this maths and so on. And people made suggestions about how it should be improved. So I said, terrific. And so I quickly started writing some joint papers. I said, by the time I'd finished my PhD, I'd written joint papers with about 5 or 6 professors, you know, who sort of got my ideas and made other suggestions and so on. So I quickly sort of, because I think you can see, I was a sort of social person. My life was all to do with interaction with people. And so science was another kind of way in which, you know, you could make progress faster by doing it with other people. And so I think it's a lot, you know, for a PhD student, quite a lot in that time. And the other amusing thing was, again, rather like going to Wildings and getting into a row with the other boys, you know, after about 4 terms, I found that an awful lot of distinguished people made a frightful error in their maths. So this was a new part of my contrarian life, was then to go and visit these various professors and all and say, excuse me, but don't you think this was a mistake? And they said, well, I think you're right about that. So that, you know, that was quite part of it, made my sort of name. You know. There are people who, you know, to make their name in science because they deliberately say, I'm going to find an error in X. You know, well, that's a bit tedious, but if it comes, it comes. You know. So I then, because I had a Trinity. BA, I could put in for Trinity Fellowship, so I put in for Trinity Fellowship, which which is quite a thing, you know, you have whatever it is, 25 theses and you're selling 4. Yeah, so it's quite a,
It is, it's very stiff.
so it's quite
Maitland didn't get one.
Is that?
F.W. Maitland, my hero.
Anyway, so I got that. It was very nice. Rad Butler made nice remarks and said that the result of the work of Dr. Hunt, we shall soon be able to reduce the electricity bills in Trinity College. And that was a bit optimistic. but so then I you know, had a sort of interesting sort of spell from travelling. I went to South Africa with my wife, and it was a visiting lecturer in South Africa for 3 months, and then we went to America for 6. I was on a Fulbright scholarship, and that was also extremely sort of influential in my sort of life, really. Partly because, you know, there was some interesting scientific work, and I sort of made American connections. But you know, we were there in '67, which was the year of when it was really hotting up in sort of racial conflicts. So on one evening we visiting friends in New York, and we drove back from Long Island, and we sort of turned right and we got onto Manhattan, and not knowing that you should go for the Lower East Side, you have the West Side. You don't normally drive through Harlem, which with your grid system you thought you might do so. Anyway, this was in the middle of a riot, and with a burning rubbish, and you know, people outside and throwing bottles. So there we are in our car, driving through this, and anyway, we just said, well, we'll just keep driving. Actually, we got through it all right. But I mean, but we saw, you know, we saw what we saw, and later I was sort of doing research. My wife worked in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and that was what was absolutely fascinating. Was the anti-Vietnam War movement was run more efficiently than any British industry I had ever seen to that date. I mean, it was, you know, the Americans. The extraordinary about Americans is that they decide on a group activity, as they used to do, and then they stop talking about it, and they keep on doing it. Whereas any British voluntary group, they keep talking about what the voluntary group is doing all the time, and therefore it's very, very boring to get down to the reality. The Americans quickly get over the objectives and down to the, you know, delivery, you know, and so they are very effective at these kind of campaigns. And so to be with those million people, you know, marching on the Pentagon, you know, which Norman Mailer described in Armies of the Night. So we were there, just, you know, a little bit behind Norman Mailer. You know. It was just an extraordinary experience. The only time I've been to the Pentagon is over the back gate, even though I've never been through the front door, but I have been over the back fence. But apparently I say that to Americans. I say there are lots of people like you, they say. so
Terrorists, we call them.
What?
Terrorists, we call them.
That's right. But it was extraordinary, you know, you had the American soldiers, you know, were formed up in squares, you know, and people were literally putting, you know, flowers in their guns and so on. But it was very sort of interesting, you know, being buzzed by helicopters. And then the next day the CBS was saying, you know, to the cries of encouragement from Radio Hanoi, millions of people marched to Pentagon. But driving down to Washington from New York, the highway was completely full. I mean, it was bumper to tail, 4 lanes. It was just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And then we were by the reflecting pool, and you know, all these sort of speakers marching over the bridge, Arlington Bridge. It was really quite an event, really. And so is that. So when I and I had to say that during the previous part of that year, we were in Africa, and Ron and I were on a bus in Africa. My father was also part of this sort of, you know, end of empire scenarios. This is when the Ugandan army, you know, went out of control, and we were in a bus which was taken over by the Ugandan army, which is quite an army, really. But actually, it turned out to be a good thing, because if you were taken over by one bit of the army, then when you hit a roadblock with another bit of the army, you went through the roadblock. You know, whereas if you'd just been without the army on board. But they were very frightening, and you could see, you know, the timidity and so on. And so I've been in quite a few, inadvertently, you know, events like this, and you know, you see the power and the way in which humans suddenly moving from an orderly way into a very disorderly way, and very violent towards each other, and and therefore I suppose from that point of view, I'm a sort of, I incline towards the authoritarian. I mean, keeping, society can blow. I mean, I start from the school. Society is a dangerous thing. It's terrific powers in society, and they can go off course, and therefore you've got to be precautious about this. Whereas there are, you could say, extreme libertarians whose first thing is what happens if Mr. X gets put in prison for the wrong reason. If that's your entire objective, you are in danger of losing other things. So, and that's obviously a permanent debate in politics. So my personal experiences have been that people want to be in an ordered situation, and they're very frightened, very, very frightened when it gets out of control. And so you must be very careful about that. So I'm, I think sometimes people think of me as an anarchistic person, but I'm not an anarchistic person. I've been head of the School of Dragons, and
you believe in authority.
I believe in keeping things within a dragon spirit. You know what I mean? Of sort of a minimum force, but you've got to sort of you've got to do that. So I returned from the United States in January 1968.
Look at me, that's
I look at you, yeah, sorry. And I joined the Central Electricity Research Laboratories, and I was given this interesting task of looking at the sort of background theory and understanding why 3 out of 6 cooling towers all collapsed one day in about 1965 in a high wind, and as they collapsed they were all vibrating. The story of the Yorkshire builders, where they were going like a belly dancer, so there was this tremendous vibrations in and out. So they gave me the time then to begin to study turbulence, which I had not studied before. So I spent a lot of time at the Science Museum under Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, as you probably saw in the marvelous film of the Ipcress file, where they have this scene in that long library. So I read all this stuff and soon began to sort of develop new ideas about how turbulence impacts on buildings. So we then did experiments there, and that emerged later on into sort of big theory of how turbulence is distorted. In fact, my whole sort of professional life sort of started with this in academic research on what we call inhomogeneous turbulence, and was turbulence that is changing very rapidly as it's distorted, as it obviously is when it impacts on a big building. Whereas traditionally turbulence is a kind of a bit like molecules or eddies that are sort of well mixed up and slowly evolving one with the other, which is quite different and sort of drastically sort of impacting them on a structure. And really I sort of almost began to invent that subject of highly inhomogeneous turbulence. We could use different bits of mathematics to create a general theory. But that, as it were, has taken many years and continued after I'd left the electricity generating board. While I was there, it was interesting. Other things were interesting. One was that, which again I've sort of learned later about, here was an organisation in which people were living in different sort of silos and not communicating very much. And the scientists, some of them were dealing with extraordinarily large questions of the big growing UK nuclear power program. They were also dealing with acid rain. So I was very interested in the practical side because I was already interested in sort of social aspects. And again, what was extraordinary was that we all knew that acid rain was happening there in the CEGB laboratories. It's like 68. It wasn't officially recognised by the government for about 20 years afterwards. Even now in the House of Lords, it's interesting. I say to people, well, we all knew about this in the 60s. It's good, you knew about it. It was officially known. I said, well, we did the calculations and the aeroplanes. And it was also very interesting kind of, a piece of politics that comes right forward to now is that the earlier research I was doing in my PhD, sponsored by the Electricity Board, came to a grinding halt because they said that nuclear power was going to be so cheap you barely need to meter it. That was the great expression of the 60s. And we had some discussions in sort of seminars about why they were pushing ahead with nuclear power so strongly. Since the Act of Parliament that set up the electricity generating board made no mention of nuclear as being the sort of raison d'etre of this institute. But as I learnt, the ministers in passing the Act stated in Parliament that this was one of the primary roles of this great organisation, CEGB. And as I learnt later in Parliament and from lawyers, there's something called the Pepper-Hart Act, or case, which says that what a minister says during the passage of a bill is almost part of the law, and so it was something, of course, not most people realise that in the British Constitution. And we also did extraordinary experiments of looking at icing of overhead electric cables and oscillations of the wind, so it was sort of a big time. But I then was given an offer or suggestion to apply for a job back in Cambridge, so my fellowship was continue. So in 1970 I was appointed as a lecturer in applied mathematics, which was quickly turned into a joint lectureship in engineering. So I had a very interesting time then for 22 years here in Cambridge as a lecturer in these two departments. The great advantage was both departments thought of me as in the other department, and therefore I avoided much of the administrative responsibilities that befall many of my colleagues. And I was able to have projects and research students between these two things, and my colleagues were very understanding about that. And we were able to initiate new courses on, for example, the issues of environment, which were sort of growing. That was interesting in the early 70s, as I was discussing on the local Cambridge radio this morning. In the early 70s, one of the questions of the famous inspector of alkalis, the old air pollution inspector, was, are we going into a period of a new ice age? And because of the dust in the atmosphere, it was going to sort of keep the sun out, and therefore this was going to be a problem. And indeed, there were cities in London, as there still were recently in India, where there's so much dust it made you feel cold. But by the late middle 70s, when we had the first incredibly hot summer in 76, and people began to measure the increasing carbon dioxide on the big mountain in Hawaii, the move was more the other way to be concerned about climate change. But still, and I lectured the engineering department, and the engineering students were interested in that. One of my more amusing but also informative points was I used to ask the students in this air pollution course about an experiment which took place in London, which was that they looked at the blood of policemen who were on traffic point duty in Fleet Street. And the blood indicates whether you've been smoking or not. It also indicates whether you've been breathing in fumes from cars. And what they found was that a policeman on traffic duty after 4 hours actually had less of this carbon in their blood than before. And so I asked the student, what was the reason? And they said, have you ever seen a policeman smoking while he's on traffic duty? And so they all learnt. This was the 70s, the class that stopped smoking for about 3 days while they took in this message. But more, so you could see I was interested in teaching.
Did you have many PhD students? Or?
So I began to have. Progressively, I had more and more PhD students, and some who worked on this important theory of how turbulence changes over hills and around buildings. So that was taking on the work that I had begun. Then I began to also work on the sort of serious questions of how pollutants disperse in the atmosphere. So that required understanding of turbulence, but then how you understand diffusion. And so I wrote some sort of important papers there, and it was quite nice to see writing papers, people quickly picking them up and then using them in America, for example, for practical purposes. And in fact, it was at that time again, it was very difficult to get new ideas being applied in the UK for improving the way we estimated how pollution moved around. And I quickly began to get the idea that if you got the Americans to adopt it, it might be easier to adopt it over here. And in fact, there was a marvellous old chief alkaline inspector, and I said, well, the the methods you're doing are wrong. He said, laddie, he said, we haven't lost a court case since 1902, he said. So I knew where I was. But we went to America on sabbatical leave and worked with the Environmental Protection Agency and helped them with very nice experiments in a big facility and also field experiments. And there's a hill in Idaho where they have the pollution impacting on the hill and going around it and over it. And this verified without beyond doubt, the way in which pollutants, move in these sort of complicated flow situations. Sort of moving forward, by the middle 80s, I'd done this work and we were finding written reports on it from various then British government departments. So a number of people felt that at that point we really needed to make it all systematic. And so with colleagues, we formed a small company here in Cambridge, Cambridge Environmental Research Consultants, which started with just one telephone answering machine, and then it moved to an office up on Shire Hall, and now it's on King's Parade. And with support from many British government agencies who realised that we were moving to computers, that we had to have systems that people would be able to use reliable methods, but not necessarily themselves have tremendous training. And our methods were ones that people were able to use after only 2 or 3 days training. And it was quite amusing because in a way we were fortunate, because the late 80s was a time of great change in the computer business. The personal computer was invented in the late 70s and early 80s, but it was a very clunky instrument. And then Mr. Gates invented MS-DOS, which was an operating system of the IBM computers, and at the same time there was a new system of presenting data on a map on a screen, so-called geographical information systems, which came from California. And then we thought it was really important to have a kind of very graphical system on a screen that would enable somebody just to move things across the screen and make a decision. So we, with great trepidation, began our own Windows, but we were very fortunate that we didn't go very far down that track before Mr. Gates invented his own Windows. But if you've actually tried to kind of do that yourself, you're in a very good position to then understand it when somebody else comes along and does it, has done it properly. So, in a way, we were sort of fortunate on the crest of a wave, as of course many people are who form both do research but also form small companies. But at the same time, during this period, it was a very, very interesting period. The head of my department was Professor Batchelor, who was a very intense person.
New Zealand or Australia?
Australian, that's right. In fact, when I was appointed to applied mathematics in 1970, I was the only Englishman on the sort of applied side. They were all Australians, New Zealanders, and one Scotsman. Progressively, that has changed. But he was a very inspiring, extraordinary man. But he was a rather fierce man, and departmental meetings of which I was once or twice were extraordinary affairs. And he would turn to a colleague and say, "Well, what have you ever done in your career?" And the poor man was absolutely flabbergasted. I remember one occasion, or he said to a bunch of people, "What is your department? What has your side of the department done?" So they were not used to this rough and tumble kind of approach. So I quickly came to their defense. "Well, don't you know about the Goldstone boson?" "Oh yes, the Goldstone boson. That's right. We invented that." So honour was restored. But it was that was sort of traditional Cambridge. I think it's sort of those things have gone now. People call themselves by their surnames and were savage to each other in meetings. It's just extraordinary. I don't think it was very helpful, really, but it certainly was a style of communication.
One of the Australians there who had some overlap with your interest is Herbert Huppert, who I also interviewed. Tell me about Herbert as I've interviewed him.
Oh well, Herbert came by the United States from Australia, and what the interesting thing was, because he was an Australian, he had a very easy relationship with George Batchelor, I mean, George, what was always interesting was that sort of, junior research, junior PhD students or others would always talk about sugar very easily because they were Australian. If one was an Englishman, I felt rather trepidation of it. But eventually, I began to sort of soften. But Herbert was started off in oceanography and doing very interesting work in that area, and then he sort of switched from that to study fluid mechanics of volcanoes and avalanche-like problems. And his work has been quite influential in that field. But he obviously didn't enjoy the whole supervision side of college life very much, which I found that very interesting. I mean, I keep bumping into people all over the place whom I supervised, and I found that quite fun. I met somebody last night at a launch party of a book, and he said, "Oh, well, you taught me about this, taught me about Dirac functions. I'm not sure I understood it," he said, but I mean, it's a very intense life of a Don in Cambridge, where you're doing supervisions of research and lecturing, and in my case, consulting and so on. But the other thing I haven't sort of mentioned was that when I came back from America in '68, I had been so appalled really by what I had been seeing about the ethnic divide and the riots. I sort of threw myself into local politics in Britain, first in London, the Labour Party, where we had a lot of debates in the late 60s. I was on the right wing of the Labour Party. The Labour Party was very fierce in London, well, unconstructive, I thought. But coming to Cambridge was very interesting, and here there was this big move being under discussion as to whether Cambridge should start have really have its own science park and develop industry and business associated with science. And Trinity College, which I was at, used its premises for its land for the first science park. And that really began to change things a lot in Cambridge. It changed the whole atmosphere of Cambridge and the street where we lived. We had these Americans coming in and worked on these science companies. But it was amusing in the Labour Party was some people were horrified. They said, "My God, we have all these middle-class people coming to Cambridge. It'll be even more difficult to get Labour members on the council." And one person said, "And do you know what it'll be like? It'll be like an inland Bournemouth," they said. That's this sort of kind of example of... but it was a very important, very interesting. I mean, the Cambridge Science Park and Science Phenomenon that now employs 30,000 plus people in this area has revolutionised Cambridge, and people look to it from all over the world. And it was nice to be, on the one hand, part of it in Trinity College and in the park, and also part of setting up one's own company. And so a lot of people were really getting their science and getting it used, and I felt that was exciting, and it also made Cambridge breathe a bit more. I think we had a lot of people here. I was much involved. I take a bit of credit for that. Was that one of the big companies that came was Schlumberger, which is a sort of French-American company in oil exploration, and I acted as a consultant to them, and they, Mr. Bernard Vivet, said to me, "Julian, where do you think we should put our big lab?" I said, "For goodness sake, Bernard, we must put it on university land where I can bicycle to easily. Do not put it on the Trinity Science Park where there's plenty of buildings in it, and if you put it in the Science Park, I'm afraid the money will go, as I said, under the senior bursar's bed. Whereas if you put it in the university coffers, the university is very strapped for cash. We'll be able to use money. They'll be able to use the money immediately." And as Swindon Dyer, who was on the planning committee, which I was also on at the university, he immediately took that $3 million and bought the old Addenbrooks, which was otherwise going to be sold. So it was, I felt a little bit by getting Schlumberger to go onto university land, the cash was, and now we have the Judge Business School there, so very important. But there really was a serious threat that we were going to lose that building. So you can see that, in fact, I was on the City Council for 3 years, from 1971 to 1974, and my second year I was leader of the Labour group. And during that time we introduced pedestrianisation in Cambridge. It was a all-party agreement. One of the minor reforms I made was to allow council tenants to choose the colour of their front door when it was painted by the council. It used to just be Corporation Green or something. So I did. This was all part of my life, as well as, of course, as being a father but by the and the other dimension, I would say, which was a very exciting dimension, and I think all of these things I was able to experience in England, in Cambridge at that time, which I don't think I would have done had I been in America, was of course the great European dimension. I mean, I was an anti-European in the 60s. I went there with my wife and friends in the car, and I was astonished to see sort of people on horseback, you know, ploughing fields in Germany in the 60s, and I thought, gosh, you know, are we really paying for all this, you know? And it all seemed, and there was this sort of, you know, the sort of claptrap expression. It was a sort of, you know, Catholic conspiracy. It was the Council of Europe and so on. But actually, I began to have some excellent European friends, German friends, and I sort of began to see, and with actually I was very keen on this sort of European mechanics movement, and I began to take a very big role in stimulating European meetings, and that was and collaborations with the European projects from the European Union were very exciting. We had to interact with people all across Europe. And some of the ideas I had certainly emerged from that period. And by the middle 80s, we had an extraordinary afternoon one day when about 3 or 4 Frenchmen came to visit us in Dampton. So there should be a big European centre for fluid mechanics and computing, and we wondered about that. But what they did turn into was a network, a very effective network of 150 laboratories and companies across Europe, and I was the Secretary General, as they call it. And that's been very effective, and that's continued for 20 years. Brussels is not very happy with this bottom-up movement. They like to control everything, but we've learned to live with them. So, from this sort of really sort of frenetic life, really, but I will say that we always had holidays and sabbatical trips, and then I had this. That's why I did a very important thing. I joined the Meteorological Dining Club. I was invited to join that in the middle 80s.
So London club.
Yeah. So I went down there, whatever it was, once a month, and met other members of the meteorological office and talked with them. I was doing some consulting advisory work with the Met Office, but then I had a telephone call in 1991 or something. You know, would I be interested in applying for the job of head of the Met Office? And so I paused for 30 seconds and said, yes, I'd be very, very interested in that position. Because I had actually applied for 1 or 2 other positions, sort of research professor positions and so on, or apply. The Royal Society had one to do with industry, but I wasn't successful. So this idea of then moving to Bracknell for 5 years, being in charge of an organisation with 2,500 people and 300 researchers, you know, was very, very exciting. And as I say, climate issues was emerging, but also the point was that, you know, whereas computers were not being used in weather forecasts reliably in the early 70s, you know, by this time the connection between the science and the computing and the big satellites, it was all beginning to come together. And so it wasn't just an administrative job, but you know, you were a job in which every day you'd be it would be very technical. So I was it was rather amusing. The head of the Met Office said, "Would you be interested in applying?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Now we know how to frame the advertisement." He said, "This is what's called an open competition system." So I was interviewed. It was quite funny in a sort of formidable interview in Whitehall. 2 of the people on the board were sort of Cambridge kind of, you know, heads of they say senior Cambridge. Dyer was one of them, and Ron Oxford was another one. But there were 2 key questions in the interview. One was from the second permanent Undersecretary of the Ministry of Defence. He said, and I had been briefed by somebody in the Ministry of Defence about this. He said, but the key question is, if you're asked the question, do you think the Met Office should be in the Ministry of Defence? You must say yes if you want the job, because that's where it was at the moment. See? And he said, you wouldn't want to go and join those environment people. They wear sandals, you know. so it was a sort of an anomaly that stretched back to Winston Churchill in 1919, that we had one Met Office in Britain. Many other countries have multiple sort of meteorological agencies. And he banged the table and said, it'll be in my ministry, as it was. So providing I answered that question, yes, I got through the first hurdle. And the second one was a sort of eager man from BP, and who asked the sort of tricky question, well, how would you make some reform, some changes, you know? And so I said, I'll get the people together. So you believe in committees, do you? So I said, oh, well, no, of course not. No, we're very constructive. So I managed to sort of argue backwards out of that one, or sideways, and got the job. But it was very challenging and interesting. And
it says in one of the articles on you that you had to do a lot of changes and reform it in a number of ways.
Yes. It originally was a sort of, you know, within the government. It was called the Met Office, but it was very much entirely within the government, all the budgets and the management. Then in 1989 or thereabouts, it had become what's called an executive agency, so it had a certain amount of independence under my predecessor, Sir John Horton. But then, soon after I got there, they then wanted to turn into a different sort of agency, a sort of so-called trading fund agency, in which you would sort of make a profit at the end of the year. But instead of then being given an assured amount of money by all the different government departments, you were in a much higher risk situation, in which the money that originally was given to the Met Office was then given to the sort of the clients in government. So, for example, the Royal Air Force, different parts of the Royal Air Force, were given this money, and they could have spent the money on having more meteorology and less aeroplanes, or more aeroplanes and more crashes and less meteorology. You know, so you put the decision, you know, firmly in the hands of the person who was going to make use of your information. And similarly all round. And so what was very, so we worked on this, and we had one of these famous city accountancy management advisory firms advising us, and that was quite amusing. So we had a bit of this to start with, and that was interesting. And we it was part of this local, we used to call total quality improvement. But it was to do with getting people to really think about how the organisation was working and the communication systems, but it's very soon you find these gurus. They all actually have their own ideas, you know. So I tried a new question on them. So I said to this guru, I said, so if you were stuck on a desert island and you could only have 2 books on management methods with you, which 2 would you choose? And he'd never been asked that question before, so he had to declare where his inclinations lay. But by that time I'd begun to hear what the orthodoxies were. But it was very interesting, you know, to an organisation that was quite rigid, really, and not a lot of communication, you know, to introduce all these sort of methods of communication. I did a lot of talking in public meetings with staff, and I think they all knew me by the end, which was not true of my predecessor, or I think my successor either. But the final conclusion then was to become what's called a trading fund on this basis that we've just discussed. What was interesting then was we had no idea, or not much of an idea, as to what the kind of profit would be at the end of the year, or the balance would be, because, you know, we were assuming, we had to estimate what would these RAF people and BBC people do. To our astonishment, we'd made the most frightful error. We got twice the profit we were meant to. So it was 20 million instead of 10 million. You know, that's an even worse error, I think, than making a loss, because nobody had assumed that. So this actually, by that time, I had then left. So my successor, quickly they took away some of the sort of agreements they'd made. For example, they'd agreed the government to pay for satellites, which is an extraordinarily large, expensive, like 30% budget or something on that. So that changed. But what was interesting really was it was a bit like being a sort of academic here, going into the lab in the afternoon in the engineering department, talking to students, going at the end of the day into the forecasting office and seeing, you know, hurricanes off Florida or snowstorms in Iraq and all these sort of things. And I got very, very interested in that at a kind of human level. I mean, I was horrified 3 weeks after I arrived at the job in January 1992 to read in the Sunday papers thousands and thousands of people dying of cold and hunger on the borders of Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, following the first Gulf War. And we knew that there was going to be these snowstorms and this cold weather, so I said to the, Monday morning, why didn't we tell these people, or tell the local services and all sorts of people about this? We knew it from our computers and so on. They said, we're not allowed to tell them, under international rules. You're only allowed to tell people if they've got a hurricane. You're not allowed to tell them if they've got a snowstorm or wind or rain. That is still the case. That is still the case. And when we raised this, they said, you Brits, you're trying to tell people everything, and indeed, in the international meeting where I spoke on natural disasters in 1994, Chinese delegates said, this is monstrous interference in the internal affairs of other countries. But progressively, we did start, because we greatly improved the methods of forecasting hurricanes, much better than anybody else, and that was because one of the things of a seminar, one of the things I've always liked in my life, there have been, I don't know, 6 or 7, when I've given a seminar, and there's somebody at the back of the room stands up at the end, well, Professor Hunt, I think you're completely wrong on this, why don't you do the following, or equivalent, or I know it, but did you know this, and so on. So this was a seminar in Beijing, and this nice man called Johnny Chan from Hong Kong said, I think you could do a lot better than on your hurricane forecast. So I said, okay, and we invited him to Bracknell, and literally with a few lines of computer code in about 3 or 4 weeks, we suddenly improved the accuracy by 30% or something. So it's just extraordinary. And then this method was picked up with the rest of the world. So that greatly improved our status. There have been other nice occasions. I mean, there was a marvelous occasion in Japan when I was teaching the mortification of the Japanese. A man at the back of the room arrived drunk, which is very unusual in Japan, and then shouted in the back of the room, Professor Hunt, I don't think anybody can understand what you're saying at all. So I said, well, you may be right. And so I spoke more slowly. But the Japanese thought this was a humiliating experience. So always be watching out for the man at the back of the room, or the person at the back of the room, in my experience. So part of my time then at the Met Office, was this international dimension. One represented the United Kingdom, and at this meeting in Geneva every summer, we had 2 weeks there, sometimes 3 weeks there, so I used to sort of dive into the cold waters of Lake Geneva in the evening after all this hot air. But we really made some big progress. I mean, my first year there, I got them to then finally publish every year what the temperature of the world, the average temperature of the world was. It had never been published before that regularly, so people, and this is then put in newspapers all around the world. So I was quite strong on information. I tried to get them, that was just marvellous, the best one was that I tried to get them to improve their financial reporting systems, which again. So I said, now remember this is an organisation with 6 or 7 languages, you see. So I said the accounts of this organisation are worse than the parish council. Oh God, that was translated into Russian, Chinese, Arabic, God knows what. And they came up to us, I'm very glad you think religion is important in meteorology, Professor. As indeed it is in Norway, where the Ministry of Religion and Meteorology are combined. Of course, Wednesday and Thursday, as we all know, are the meteorological days of the week, Woden and Thor. So I should had to be cautious about jokes. But no, it was absolutely a sort of gripping experience, and we made considerable improvements. In one of the big changes was that until 1995, it was quite extraordinary. Meteorology was entirely concerned with the world outside towns, bearing in mind by predictions were that by 2000 or 2005, more than 50% of people would be living in urban areas, and in the meteorology of urban areas, it really was important. So we moved to an important resolution, and that began to change. But all of that, it wasn't just time wasted against my time at the Met Office, but it's all connected. During that time, I was continuing to be a professor here, a visiting professor in Cambridge, and I used to come up here on Saturdays, and I had students here, and some you know, I began to sort of move forward into the next phase of my academic research. But it was, you know, the other thing was one was in Whitehall. So I suppose the most extraordinary thing about Whitehall really was what a sort of devious, you know, place it is. You know, people lobbying, and they're dealing with very big issues. And this is the politest way I can sort of describe it. Is we once had a meeting for very senior people at MOD, and the meeting began sort of an away day. We were talking about how we operated. And one senior person who then became head of government security, you know, said the trouble with these organisations, everybody lies. So the permanent secretary was a bit shocked by this sort of candidness. And then he said, well, actually, people have to lie because they're dealing with such difficult things, they can't almost say the truth. So people say something and immediately then deny it, you know, but actually they've thrown their stone in the pond and ripples happen. And it's almost, and he was commenting the fact that in Britain we have the defence, the army people and the civilian people all in the same organisation, which is terrifically stressful in terms of decisions. Most other countries separate them somewhat. But nevertheless, I mean, I was surprised and shocked that, you know, you'd agree with somebody with something and then suddenly it would be denied, and you have to sort of go around to somebody above that. So I used to say to myself, Hilaire Belloc's little rhyme every day, you know, Matilda told such dreadful lies, it made you gasp and stretch your eyes, and it was the curious thing with the academic world is that people really don't lie very much. I mean, I really never came across some blatant, you know, said somebody and they would deny it. That never happens here, but that's quite common there. I mean, senior Parliament. So I grew up, I suppose, in many ways, and you had to think of situations. So, for example, I was quickly told you must never, ever say something is unacceptable, because you have no way of retreat. Every remark you must make, you must think, well, supposing they deny, where do I go through from there? And I think that's going to stick me in good stead subsequently, sometimes with my wife too, you know. But anyway, so the time came to, you know, consider what happened next, and I had a sort of small extension of 6 months in the Met Office, and I then decided, you know, went back into the academic world, but at the same time maintaining my company, which I went back to as a sort of director. So in it was very interesting. In sort of 1997, I first of all spent 3 months in Toulouse working on the French Institute connected to the French Met Office, and seeing all the different things. And then I went to America and carried on with this sort of more and more of this sort of environmental work. So it was quite interesting. I'd sort of become by this time sort of a weather person. You know, I really understood weather and the difficulties. But one of the features of you know, weather is the local, it's very local nature. And but the weather is like other things. You know, you have sort of standard models of it. You know, so for example, everybody has an idea of a valley. You know, and what happens in a valley. And in fact, it turns out that everybody's idea of a valley is a Swiss valley. You know, essentially, the Swiss having got there first and described it. You know, so for example, when the sun comes up in the morning, the airflow rises up the sides of the valley, and when the sun comes down, it comes down again. You know, but actually, you go to Arizona, and suddenly you're in a valley that is whatever it is, 30 miles wide and 100 miles long, and you find that the sun goes down and the airflow is still going up the valley for another 5 hours. You know. And constantly, and similarly in the morning. So you know, what was extraordinary was that everybody was in the orthodoxy. This is what a valley flow is. But every day they were seeing something different. But you know, sometimes you say, well, actually, look around you. You know, you're going to see something different. And that's been a bit of a feature of my work. So I then did come back to Cambridge. That was an interesting experience because if you've left a place and then you've become changed as a person as well as intellectually, it's very difficult to go back to that place again, because you think you're something different. They think you're the old person, you know? And there's a total disconnect. You know, they thought I was Julian Hunt. I was in doubt. I'd gone for 5 years. I was the same Julian Hunt, but I was a different person. Saw things differently, wanted to do things differently, as well as continue. And there were some other sort of curious aspects of sort of financial businesses from my benefits I would had, and people felt I should not have from my periods in the Met Office. So I, as in the best Trinity ways, they decided they would not give me, for example, my Met Office pension. I had to hand that back to Trinity College if I got it, which seemed to be very odd. So other people in the college who had pensions from other jobs didn't hand them back to the college. So as always, there was a big discussion of College Council, and the votes against me were 13-2. So I said, well, obviously, I said, the writing on the wall, I better leave. So I then went, because I was still become a non-stipendiary fellow or something. So I then went back, which was already a good thing, to University College, where I went in 1999 as a professor of climate modelling, which was really appropriate, because Cambridge, I was really sort of amazed when I came back to Cambridge in 98, really, that it was completely split. I mean, there was no environmental cross-disciplinary thinking at all. Nobody's really thinking about climate. It just wasn't, it was nowhere near what all the big international or even discussions were taking place. So I returned, I went to University College, and that was a very interesting experience, because in a sense it's a more empirical place, getting back to Benthamism and so on, utilitarianism. People really look at the usefulness of things, the data and so on, before they think about the intellectual idea behind it. Whereas in Cambridge, it's the idea first and other things later. Oh, that has great strengths, of course. But I had my friends and colleagues here, and I used to come up to Trinity. So from 1999 to the present, well, I retired, but I continued to be active in climate modelling and lecturing. In London, I think we're focusing on the Antarctic regions, which are the areas where the climate is changing most rapidly in the world, and it's also associated with complex problems of turbulence and mountains. But during this period, I was it had happened that 1997, the Labour Party won the election. And I should have mentioned, when I was at the Met Office, I caused frightful problems, because on 2 or 3 occasions I was invited to advise the trade unions and invited to advise the Labour Party leaders like Michael Leacher and others about the way government had been changed under Mrs. Thatcher, these new sort of government agencies, and I said I thought this was an effective form of government. In fact, the Labour Party had sort of invented it in the 60s. They called it hiving off, that was the word then. But I got a bit of a sort of, hand slap by the MOD people as a sort of civil servant lecturing, talking to the potential incoming government. And I even did something even more terrible, was I wrote it down and gave them a piece of paper as to what I thought was doing. And but in a way, but there's a word, so I had just, you could say, I wasn't a plot, but because they knew me, I'd been helping the Labour Party, people put me up for a peerage, a life peerage when the Labour Party came back to power. And I still think I'm the only scientist being appointed to the sort of senior scientist appointed to the Labour benches in the whole, whatever it is, 13 years or 12 years of Labour government. There'll be many scientists appointed to the cross benches, but not to the Labour benches. So I was then appointed in 2000, and I had to choose the position of which I had my peerage. So because there were 3 other Lord Hunts, I chose the Lord Hunt of Chesterton, which is the district of Cambridge so I really found that very interesting this last 8 or 9 years, being on being in the House of Lords. I think I've made some impact here and there, but one of the most sort of intriguing things was within a month of arriving in the House of Lords, there was a bill, a sort of transport bill, which had been widely proclaimed in the Labour Party manifesto in 1997. This was going to be the first bill to really integrate transport and the environment, and because I've worked on pedestrianisation in the city of Cambridge and excluding traffic and pollution, I'm very interested in that. And then the bill arrived in the House of Lords, and furthermore, the government had formed this new department, DETR, Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions. So the bill arrived in the House of Lords, and I read it, and to my astonishment, page after page after page, there was transport regulations, and then we were going to tax people who went to cities and so on and so on. But the word environment was nowhere in the bill, in 200 pages. So I said, I was at a lunch, I said to Michael Meacher, I said, Michael, isn't that some frightful mistake? The word environment is not in this bill. He said, I don't believe you. He turned to the civil servant next to him. Is he right? He said, I'm afraid he is right. So Michael, so very quick as a flash, said, so you've got time to read bills, have you? Which is a sort of other worrying idea that ministers in departments of producing bills don't read them. So this bill had been drafted, and it had gone right through the Commons on the whip, and the word had not changed. So in the Lords, the word environment was sprinkled liberally, through the bill, because that was the purpose of it, and the purpose of taxing the cars was to improve the environment. The Tories said this is a tax-raising bill, which it was as it was written. So then I sort of, one of the things I then learned was, because I had been a civil servant in the Met Office, I could ring people up in Whitehall, and still can, and they know I'm not going to embarrass them, I'm going to sort of, so I said, well, how could this happen? And, this is very easy, we've got DETR, we've got E people and T people, and if you give the bill to the T people, they'd rather die than mention the E word, It's like a party game, and funnily enough, that after a couple of years, that department split back again to the Department of Transport, Department of Environment, and now there's much more environmental work in transport. So it was sort of, well, that's just sort of an example, and one just has to be on one's guard. But one of the big improvements, of course, in legislation has been this so-called pre-legislative scrutiny. So before a bill comes out, a draft bill is produced, and witnesses are called, and individual members of the Parliament, the public, can write in their comments, and then the government does a response to those comments before it actually publishes the bill. That's a lot more intelligent, and I know a few other countries in the world, they certainly did it in America. In America, they start 5 bills simultaneously, 5 different committees, and it's just extraordinary. So it's quite efficient in a way, and this pre-legislative scrutiny is people from both houses, and I was on one this last year to do with coasts, the marine environment, and we had one committee, and we made a number of strong points, and some of them were included in the bill. So I felt that that's been a sort of really useful experience, and I've been able to use my background and so on. But I haven't, in sort of kind of, you could say, winding up. I mean, I think from a political point of view, the great thing really is that the UK is part of Europe. I mean, that to me is, as I say, I wasn't enthusiastic beforehand, and that gives us a bigger canvas on which to operate politically. And in the civil service, all the civil servants, their peer group are other civil servants in Europe and so on. It's just incredibly easy. Even now, of course, the Houses of Parliament are the only parliament, I believe in the Czech Republic, the only parliament which does not fly the European flag outside, except one day a year, and they don't fly it outside Parliament, they fly it in the middle of the Parliament Square. So we are still reluctant. Today, tomorrow is the European elections, of course. We're still reluctant Europeans, but that's been a great thing. And then from a scientific point of view, it's been amazingly exciting. And even now, I'm involved in many projects, and having a company that is dealing with the European issues. So if we deal with wind or environment or something or climate, we do it right across Europe, and the impact therefore is global.
Even though I remember when we met in the street, you said you had something to do with the Beijing Olympics as well.
Oh yes, well one of the projects that we did in our company, was first of all in London to provide forecasts of tomorrow's air pollution to individuals living in different streets, because the pollution from traffic varies from one street to the next, and we get the sort of information from satellites about the broad atmospheric conditions, and then we do calculations, and then we have with mobile phones, which of course is another great revolution in this last 30 years. We can then send messages to people's individual mobile phones, and the same method, we were then using it was picked up by in Beijing to provide information on a street-by-street basis, because the pollution is different. I just was in Beijing in May, and it was just seeing a very bad level of pollution. It was an important thing to do. So that's an example, really. I mean, my wife is asthmatic, and so I'm well aware of people having breathing difficulties, and so if you can give them advice, they actually take that seriously. I mean, the future, one hopes that we'll get people like that, and farmers and others, to not only give them information, but then for them to give you information back again, sort of to say how well they felt, and then you'll be able to give them even more focused advice in the future.
I've got two questions, which then if there's anything else that I'd like to get in. One is that it mentions, I think in one of the articles, that you, apart from the Antarctic, you have an interest in Asian monsoons, and that you have been warning that the frequency or the precipitation or something from monsoons is likely to vary quite considerably soon.
Yes, one of the things I've done in Parliament, is join this very rewarding group called GLOBE, Global Legislators of a Balanced Environment, and this is a kind of a meeting place of parliamentarians, not ministers, from the leading industrial companies of G8, and plus, but then plus 5 others: India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico. And in one of those meetings, I met colleagues from India who were commenting that in the year 2006, the Assam, where you are familiar with, had a drought for the first time in recorded history, as far as I gather, and on average over the whole area, the rainfall was about half. And this is an area in the world which is one of the wettest places in the world. They always used to say it was the wettest.
Yes,
place, but it's not quite. But it's very, very extremely wet. At the same time, the rainfall in the northwest of India, which is normally desert in the summer, the Thar Desert, Rajasthan, was lots of rain, first time for 50 years. So these kind of patterns, can change with some changes in the sort of profile of temperature in the atmosphere, which is being affected by climate change. And we had a further meeting just in May on this. And it's going to be very serious. The whole kind of ice and snow in the Himalayas will change in the future. Whole parts of China, it seems as if they're expecting to become deserts. So the big question really is, what is, will India, who has this huge and growing population, quite an insensitive area which depends critically on the monsoon, any sort of slight diminution of that or variation of that, will just have extraordinary consequences. That worries me greatly.
The last question I had really was about your family. I mean, you mentioned your wife, but also I know that your children are distinguished in their own fields. I don't know if you
yes, we've been very sort of fortunate, and elder daughter, Jemima, she was at school here in Cambridge, and she studied American studies at Sussex and went to America, and was an illegal immigrant for several years, working in tea shops, but nevertheless writing, and she wrote 2 novels, one of which was Living in New York, Notes from Utopia, which is a very amusing novel, which is another novel, and she's done a lot of journalism, and so she now has 2 children, and my second daughter, Tilly, she became a doctor. She's the only one of my children who's slightly scientific. She's in mathematics, but she also did art. I mean, she was extraordinary. You know, she could have had an art scholarship. Really very talented. Because my wife's father was an artist, and so she became a doctor, but she found it very stressful doing pediatrics. So she's now into general practitioner. She's an extremely good diver, very much social. And she has 2 children. She married this rather well-known novelist, Giles Foden. Interestingly, Giles has just written a book on turbulence, which was entitled Turbulence, and it's a fictionalisation to some extent of my great uncle, Louis Fry Richardson, whom he was I told him I think got very interested in, and this book has just come out this week. So he's made various sort of public announcements about getting ideas from his father-in-law, which is quite amazing. And my son Tristram, who was born in the Mill Road nursing home, he did well. He went to University College School, and he became a historian. But I think it's important to realise he sort of at Cambridge. He studied history and the footlights, and so he was sort of, the idea of presentation is an important part of his kind of makeup, and in a very witty sort of way. It wasn't actually partly footlights, partly some of the other reviews, and he wrote this. The only time that the Trinity play, which is put on at the end of the summer review, had to be censored by the senior bursar, was when he put on a play in the year that Trinity's Bank went bust bearings, and so he produced a play about Trinity College and Barings Bank, which was extremely funny. The senior bursar got very nervous about this. But anyway, you can see he was starting off on a sort of high wire career, and since when he's done television and radio and written 2 splendid books, one of which has just come out in Engels, where he worked very closely. Of course, he was a student of Gareth Stedman Jones, and Gareth very much steered him on that path. And he's married to Julian, so they have a nice baby son.
Well, we've, I think, probably come to the end, unless there's anything that you particularly feel that we've missed out. We've got 3 or 4 minutes if there's anything else. Otherwise,
no, I mean, I think it's a very fortunate life, really. I think I feel fortunate almost because of this sort of near sort of disaster at an early age and great illness, and so every day is a lucky day, really.
And I can just end by saying how nice it's to meet you again, Julian, after 60 odd years. Nearly 60 years.
I know, it's fantastic.
Lovely.
I enjoyed that very much.
Thank you very much indeed.